Hello, I am the Wizard of Tales, and I'm here to guide you today. I know this video is the perfect companion to help my dear dreamers relax and drift off to sleep. Before we dive into a world of calm and serenity, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, get cozy, take a deep breath, and let the magic of stories embrace you. In a small French village, where the aroma of fresh bread mingled with the buzz of morning conversations, lived Belle, a young girl unlike any other. While girls her age worried about dresses and suitors, she found refuge in the pages of the books she always carried with her. Her father, Maurice, was an eccentric inventor who spent his days in his workshop, creating machines that the villagers considered strange and useless. Belle had a natural beauty that attracted stares wherever she went, but it was her intelligence and kindness that really made her stand out. Every morning, she walked across the village square to the small bookshop, greeting the shopkeepers and ignoring the whispers of the people who found her peculiar for her love of reading. Gaston, the most admired man in the village, had decided that Belle would be his wife. Tall, strong, and vain, he couldn't accept that a woman could refuse his advances. For him, Belle was just a trophy to be won, and his persistence in wooing her was becoming increasingly annoying. "Belle, why waste time with these books when you could be admiring a real hero?" boasted Gaston, flexing his muscles as he weaved his way through the village. "Because, Gaston, books take me to extraordinary places and introduce me to fascinating ideas," replied Belle, trying to politely sidestep him. Maurice was working on his newest invention, an automatic woodchopping machine, when he received an invitation to present his invention at a distant fair. Belle helped her father prepare the cart, worried about the journey he would make through the gloomy forest that surrounded the village. "Be careful, Dad," Belle urged, adjusting the scarf around Maurice's neck. "The forest can be dangerous, especially at night." "Don't worry, my dear," smiled Maurice, hugging his daughter. "Philippe knows the way, and I'll be back in a few days with a first-place medal." What neither of them could have imagined was that this seemingly ordinary farewell would change their lives forever. Maurice set off at dusk, but as night fell, an unexpected storm forced him to deviate from his planned route. The wolves began to howl in the distance, and Philippe, his faithful horse, became increasingly nervous. Amid the darkness and the storm, Maurice spotted an immense iron gate. Beyond it stood a majestic castle, although its gloomy and decayed appearance suggested that it had been abandoned for a long time. Desperate for shelter, he pushed open the rusty gate and entered the castle grounds. The castle's interior was even more impressive than its facade. Ancient tapestries covered the walls, and a lit fireplace suggested that the place wasn't as abandoned as it looked. Maurice heard whispering voices, but couldn't see anyone. "Hello? Is anyone there?" he called out, his voice echoing through the empty corridors. The warmth of the fireplace and a comfortable armchair invited him to rest, but his moment of peace was brutally interrupted by a deafening roar. A monstrous shadow loomed over him, and before he could comprehend what was happening, Maurice found himself face to face with a terrible creature, half man, half animal, with sharp fangs and eyes that blazed with fury. "How dare you invade my castle?" thundered the beast, his voice resounding off the walls. Maurice tried to explain himself, trembling with fear, but the beast wasn't interested in his excuses. In a matter of minutes, the poor inventor was dragged into the castle dungeons, where cold, damp bars would be his new home. Philippe, frightened by the events, managed to escape and return to the village. When Belle saw the horse returning without her father, her heart froze. Without hesitation, she mounted Philippe and asked him to take her to where Maurice was. The journey through the dark forest didn't daunt her. Belle was determined to find her father, even if it meant facing all the dangers the forest could hide. The horse led her along the same winding path until the gates of the mysterious castle appeared in front of them. Inside the castle, seemingly inanimate objects watched her arrival with interest. Lumiere, a talking chandelier, and Cogsworth, a clock that moved on its own, were whispering about the young woman's presence. They, like all the other servants in the castle, had been turned into objects by the same curse that had affected their master. Belle found her father in the dungeon, his hands frozen and his health clearly weakened by the cold and damp. "Oh, Dad, I got to get you out of here," she exclaimed, holding her hands through the bars. It was then that the beast emerged from the shadows, his presence filling the room with terror. Belle, although frightened, didn't back down. Instead, she offered to take her father's place as a prisoner. "Would you take his place?" asked the beast, surprise evident in his hoarse voice. "Belle, no. You don't know what you're doing," protested Maurice. "If I stay, will you promise to free my father?" asked Belle, her voice firm despite the fear she felt. "Yes," replied the beast, "but you must promise to stay here forever." Belle agreed, and before Maurice could protest again, he was dragged out of the castle and sent back to the village in an enchanted carriage. Belle watched through the tower window as her father disappeared into the darkness of the forest, silent tears streaming down his face. What Belle didn't know was that her brave decision had planted the first seed of hope in the beast's hardened heart. In the highest room of the castle, an enchanted rose floated under a glass dome, its petals beginning to fall one by one. Time was running out to break the curse, and now, for the first time in years, there was a chance that true love could bloom in the shadows of that cursed castle. Night fell over the castle, bringing with it the weight of loneliness and the uncertain fate that awaited both Belle and the beast. As the young woman prepared for her first night as a prisoner, she couldn't have imagined that her life was about to change in ways that even her beloved adventure books couldn't have predicted. On her first night in the castle, Belle remained in her room, refusing to dine with the beast, despite the insistent invitations brought by Madame Samovar, a talking teapot with a motherly voice. The darkness of the room reflected her state of mind, but her natural curiosity soon began to awaken as she observed the luxurious details of her surroundings. "Mademoiselle," called a soft voice, and Belle discovered that her closet was also alive. Verlet sought to her. "Perhaps a new dress would gladden your heart." Belle was beginning to get used to the surprises of the enchanted castle. The animated objects, although initially frightening, showed a kindness that made her feel less alone. Lumiere, especially, seemed determined to make her stay more pleasant. "Mon Dieu, we can't let our guests starve," exclaimed the chandelier, organizing a spectacular musical number in the kitchen. The cutlery danced, the plates swirled, and the music filled the air with an infectious energy that even Belle couldn't resist. The surprising performance led her to explore more of the castle. Over the next few nights, while the beast remained aloof in his west wing, Belle discovered new secrets in every corridor. The library, however, remained closed, although she could see its imposing doors at the end of a long corridor. One afternoon, while walking through the snow-covered gardens, Belle noticed subtle changes in the beast's behavior. He watched her from afar, his movements less threatening, almost timid. During one of these moments, she was surprised by a group of wolves that had infiltrated the castle grounds. The beast emerged from the shadows in an instant, placing himself between Belle and the predators. The fight was fierce, and although he managed to fend off the wolves, he was wounded. Belle, who had the perfect opportunity to escape, chose to help him. "Stay still," she ordered, cleaning his wounds with warm water. "It'll sting a bit. That wouldn't have happened if you hadn't run away," growled the beast, more out of pain than anger. "And you wouldn't have been hurt if you hadn't come to save me," Belle replied, her voice softening. "Thank you." That moment marked a change in the dynamic between them. The beast began to show a gentler side, although he still struggled with his tempestuous nature. Belle, for her part, began to see beyond his frightening appearance. Cogsworth and Lumiere watched this relationship develop with renewed hope. Every little bit of progress was celebrated by the castle servants, who saw in the interactions between Belle and the beast the possibility of breaking the curse that imprisoned them. "Maybe she really is the one we've been waiting for," whispered Madame Samovar to Chip, her teacup daughter. The beast, inspired by Belle's passion for literature, decided to do something special. One morning, he led her through the corridors of the castle, blindfolded. "Trust me?" he asked, his husky voice softer than usual. When he removed the blindfold, Belle found herself in front of the most magnificent library she had ever seen. Thousands of books reached to the ceiling on shelves that seemed endless. Her eyes sparkled with a joy that made the beast's heart race. It's incredible, she exclaimed, turning to take in the vastness of the place. I've never seen so many books in my life. It's all yours, declared the beast, discovering that Belle's smile was worth more than all the treasures in the castle. Afternoons were filled with shared reading. Belle discovered that the beast was an eager, if sometimes impatient, student. She would help him with difficult words, and he would share stories about the books he had read in his youth before the curse. Meanwhile, in the village, Gaston hadn't given up on Belle. Consumed by obsession and fueled by delusions of grandeur, he plotted ways to rescue Belle, ignoring Maurice's explanations about the castle and the beast. That crazy old man needs to be taught a lesson, Gaston muttered to Le Faux, his faithful squire. And when Belle realizes that her father is in danger, she'll have no choice but to accept my proposal of marriage. In the castle, oblivious to Gaston's machinations, Belle and the beast discovered more about each other. During a particularly pleasant dinner, where the beast was trying, with comical results, to use cutlery properly, Belle noticed how his eyes, once so frightening, now conveyed a kindness she had never noticed before. "Why didn't you ever tell me your real name?" asked Belle, as they watched the stars from the balcony after dinner. The beast hesitated, painful memories of the past reflected in his gaze. "Adam," he finally answered, "but that name belongs to someone I stopped being a long time ago." Belle gently touched his hairy arm. "Maybe it's time to rediscover him." In the highest room of the castle, another petal of the enchanted rose fell silently. Time continued to pass, but for the first time since the curse had been placed, there was real hope that love could flourish in the shadows of the cursed castle. The atmosphere in the castle continued to change subtly. The once gloomy corridors seemed brighter, and the music of the enchanted servants echoed more frequently through the halls. Belle and Adam spent more and more time together, sharing stories in the library or strolling through the gardens which, with the arrival of spring, were beginning to awaken from their winter slumber. During one of these afternoons, while Adam was teaching Belle about the different species of roses in the garden, she noticed a wistful expression on his face as he observed a particularly beautiful rose bush. "What makes it so special?" asked Belle, referring to the enchanted rose she occasionally saw shining under the glass dome. Adam hesitated before answering, his voice laden with regret. "It's a constant reminder of my past mistakes. Each petal that falls marks the time I have left to." He stopped abruptly, looking away. Belle realized that there was much more to the story than he was willing to reveal, but respected his silence. Instead, she concentrated on showing him how his heart had changed, how his natural kindness was beginning to overcome his bestial appearance. Meanwhile, in the village, Gaston was putting his plan into action. He had convinced the director of the local asylum, Monsieur Dark, to take part in his scheme to have Maurice committed. "The old man is completely mad, talking about monsters and magic castles," Gaston argued to the crowd gathered in the tavern. "It's our duty to protect the village and help Maurice, and of course, comfort poor Belle in her time of need." Le Faux, although still loyal to Gaston, was beginning to question his friend's actions. "Don't you think you're going too far?" he whispered, but was quickly silenced by a threatening look from Gaston. In the castle, Madame Samovar watched with satisfaction as Belle transformed not only the beast, but the entire environment around him. "It's as if she brings light wherever she goes," she commented to Lumiere and Codsworth. But time is running out," reminded Lumiere, his flame flickering with concern. "The master must not only love, but be loved in return." One evening, Adam decided to organize a special ball for Belle. Madame de Garderobe created a dazzling dress in shades of gold, while Lumiere coordinated the ballroom preparations. The beast, nervous at the prospect of dancing, received hasty lessons in etiquette from Codsworth. When Belle came down the grand staircase that evening, Adam's heart almost stopped. She was radiant, and her smile lit up the hall more than all the chandeliers put together. The music began to play softly, and they danced as if they had been doing this all their lives. "Are you happy here with me?" asked Adam during the dance, his voice betraying his insecurity. Belle smiled, but her eyes revealed a shadow of sadness. Yes, but I miss my father. I wish I could see him, if only for a moment. Adam led her to his bedroom, where he kept a magic mirror that showed anything the viewer wished to see. Use it to see your father, he offered, handing Belle the mirror. The image that appeared in the mirror chilled Belle's blood. Maurice was staggering through the forest, coughing violently, clearly ill and disoriented. Oh no, he's sick, he's dying, she exclaimed in anguish. Adam felt his heart break when he saw the despair in Belle's eyes. He looked at the enchanted rose, whose petals were dangerously thin, and made a decision that could cost him everything. Then, you must go to him, said Adam, his voice laced with emotion. What? Belle could hardly believe her ears. I set you free. You're no longer my prisoner. The words seemed to tear pieces out of her heart as he spoke them. Belle looked deeply into Adam's eyes, seeing the pain and love they contained. Thank you for understanding how much he needs me, she said, handing back the mirror. Take the mirror with you, Adam insisted. That way you'll have a way to look back, to remember me. Belle left quickly, leaving behind a castle steeped in sadness. The servants watched her departure with heavy hearts, knowing that with her went the last hope of breaking the curse. Why did you let her go? Asked Codsworth, perplexed. I had to, replied Adam, watching Belle disappear into the darkness. I love her. The words echoed through the castle like a bittersweet whisper. The love that could have broken the curse was there, but now it seemed too late. Adam climbed to the highest balcony of the castle, his roar of agony echoing through the night as another rose petal fell softly. Belle found her father lying in the snow and took him back home, determined to look after him. But she had barely had time to settle him in his bed when she heard furious knocking at the door. It was Gaston, accompanied by a crowd carrying torches and a wagon bearing the asylum symbol. We've come for your father, Belle, Gaston announced with a cruel smile. Unless you agree to marry me. Gaston's plan was in motion, and Belle found herself trapped between love for her father and her own freedom. Meanwhile, in the castle, Adam remained in his tower, his heart torn between the joy of having known true love and the pain of having lost it forever. Belle, determined to prove her father's sanity, pulled out the magic mirror. Show me the beast, she commanded in front of the hostile crowd. The mirror shone brightly, revealing the image of Adam in all his bestial form. Screams of horror echoed through the crowd, but Belle defended herself passionately. No, he's gentle and kind. He taught me that true beauty lies within. Gaston, consumed by jealousy and anger at the look on Belle's face when she spoke of the beast, snatched the mirror from her hands. She's as much in love with the beast as he is dangerous, he shouted, manipulating the fears of the crowd. The beast will come and devour your children. We must kill the beast. The crowd, inflamed by Gaston's words, quickly turned into a furious mob. Belle tried desperately to make them understand, but Gaston ordered her and Maurice to be locked in the basement of their own house to keep them safe. I can't let him hurt the beast, cried Belle, struggling as she was pushed into the basement. He's not the beast, Gaston. You are. Meanwhile, in the castle, the servants watched with apprehension as the angry mob approached through the windows. Cogsworth, Lumiere, and all the others knew they had to defend their home and their master. If it's a fight they want, it's a fight they'll have, declared Lumiere, gathering the other enchanted objects to prepare the castle's defense. Adam, still in his tower, remained oblivious to the approaching danger. His heart was too broken to care about any threat. Belle's words about his goodness echoed in his mind, making him wonder if he really deserved such a positive judgment. In the basement of Belle's house, Chip, who had hidden in her bag during the escape from the castle, turned out to be her unexpected salvation. The little cup managed to find Morris's invention, the wood chopping machine, and with some creativity, they used it to break down the basement door. We need to get to the castle before they do, exclaimed Belle, hastily mounting Philippe. Father, are you strong enough to ride? My dear, for your sake and the beast's, I'll find the strength, replied Maurice, climbing on his horse behind his daughter. In the castle, the battle had begun. The enchanted objects bravely defended their home, using their unique features as improvised weapons. Madame de Garderobe threw clothes that came to life and attacked the invaders, while Lumiere strategically scorched the attackers' beds. Gaston, ignoring the chaos around him, searched determinedly for Adam. His only goal was to kill the beast and prove himself the hero of the story. He found him in the West Wing, sitting gloomily next to the enchanted rose. "Get up and fight," Gaston taunted, wielding his bow. "Or are you too cowardly to defend yourself?" Adam just looked sadly at his attacker, unwilling to fight. "Leave me alone," he muttered, turning to continue his solitary contemplation. The refusal to fight infuriated Gaston even more, who fired an arrow, hitting Adam in the back. The sharp pain finally awakened something inside him. Not anger or a desire for revenge, but a survival instinct that had been dormant since Belle's departure. The fight that followed was brutal, with Gaston and Adam clashing across the castle rooftops in the storm that was beginning to fall. Gaston, with his strength and hunting skills, proved to be a formidable opponent, but Adam, even wounded, possessed superhuman strength. Belle arrived at the castle just as the battle was reaching its climax. Her heart raced at the sight of a wounded Adam, fighting for his life against Gaston on the castle's slippery parapets. "Adam!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the storm. The sound of Belle's voice made Adam turn, his eyes meeting hers. In that moment of distraction, Gaston saw his opportunity and attacked again, but Adam managed to dodge at the last moment, causing Gaston to lose his balance. "Please don't," pleaded Gaston, slipping over the edge of the roof. Adam, showing the true change in his heart, reached out to save his attacker. "Take my hand," he offered, but Gaston, in his arrogance and hatred, preferred to try one last treacherous attack. The sudden movement caused him to lose his balance completely, falling into the depths of the abyss below the castle. Adam, exhausted and wounded, staggered back to the balcony where Belle was waiting for him. "You're back," he whispered, gently touching Belle's face. "Of course I'm back," she replied, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I couldn't let them hurt you. I love you." But before Adam could reply, his body succumbed to his injuries, and he fell into Belle's arms. The last petal of the enchanted rose fluttered, threatening to fall at any moment as Belle hugged Adam's inert body, her sobs echoing through the stormy night. The servants watched the scene with broken hearts, knowing that they were witnessing not only the possible death of their master, but also the end of any hope of breaking the curse. The rain continued to fall, mixing with Belle's tears as she held Adam in her arms, refusing to let him go. "I love you." Belle's words were still echoing in the air when something extraordinary began to happen. Tiny beams of golden light began to fall from the sky like shooting stars, enveloping Adam's body. Belle stood back in amazement as he was lifted into the air by an invisible magical force. The transformation was gradual and magnificent. The fur began to dissipate, the claws turned into human hands, and the bestial face gave way to the features of a young prince. The light was so intense that Belle had to shield her eyes. When she was finally able to look again, she saw a tall, handsome man standing before her, dressed in elegant clothes. The prince turned slowly, examining his own hands in amazement. His eyes, although different in appearance, held the same depth and gentleness that Belle had learned to love. "Belle," he said, his voice softer but still familiar, "it's me." Belle approached hesitantly, studying his face. When their eyes met, she immediately recognized the look. That same look she had learned to look for beyond the bestial appearance. "It's you," she exclaimed, touching his face tenderly. The kiss that followed was more than a simple gesture of love. It was the conclusion of a journey of transformation. A wave of magic exploded from the couple, spreading through the castle like a golden wave. The gloomy gargoyles turned into statues of angels, the dark walls took on vibrant colors, and the dead gardens exploded into flowers. Throughout the castle, the servants began to return to their human form. Lumiere was once again a charming maitre d', Codsworth a distinguished butler, and Madame Samovar a gentle housekeeper. Chip, who had arrived with Belle, transformed into a happy little boy, running into his mother's arms. "Mommy, Mommy, we're human again," cried Chip, jumping for joy. Maurice, who had witnessed the whole transformation from the entrance to the castle, approached slowly, still trying to process the miracle he had just witnessed. "Belle, my dear, this is extraordinary." "Father." Belle ran to embrace him, pulling Adam by the hand. "This is Adam, the man I've learned to love, who's always been there, hiding under the appearance of the beast." Adam bowed respectfully to Maurice. "Sir, I know I started our relationship in the worst possible way. I ask for your forgiveness, and, if you'll allow me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life making up for past mistakes." Maurice, seeing the sincerity in the prince's eyes and the happiness on his daughter's face, gave her a warm smile. "Belle's love has already proven its worth. If she has chosen it, that is enough for me." The next few days were filled with celebration at the castle. News of the transformation spread quickly, and little by little, the villagers began to return, discovering that Maurice's crazy stories were, in fact, true. Le Faux, who had survived the battle, became a frequent visitor to the castle, finding true friendship among the old enchanted objects. His change of allegiance symbolized how love could transform not only a cursed prince, but everyone around him. The library, which had been Adam's first real gift to Belle, became an open space for all the villagers. Belle began teaching the children to read, fulfilling her dream of sharing her love of books with others. "You see," Lumiere commented to Codsworth, watching Belle lead a reading class, "who would have thought that our salvation would come through a young girl who loved books?" "And who would have thought," replied Codsworth with a smile, "that you'd be right about anything?" The castle, once a place of darkness and sadness, became a center of light and learning. Adam and Belle ruled with wisdom and compassion, never forgetting the lessons their love story had taught them. That true beauty lies within, and that love has the power to transform even the most hardened heart. On special nights, when the moon was full and the stars shone brightly, Adam and Belle still danced in the grand ballroom, remembering that first dance that had changed their lives forever. The servants, now a real family, watched with smiles on their faces, knowing that the curse hadn't just been broken, it had been transformed into a blessing that brought love and happiness to everyone. The enchanted rose, although it had long since lost its petals, was preserved under its glass dome as a constant reminder that true love can bloom in the most unlikely places, and that the most important beauty is that which cannot be seen with the eyes. And so, in the castle that had once been cursed by arrogance, now blessed by love, Belle and Adam lived their story, not just happily ever after, but more importantly, growing and learning together every day, proving that true love is not a magical ending, but a transformative beginning. Winter had set in with unprecedented cruelty in that small village on the edge of the forest. The snow covered the roofs of the wooden houses like a heavy white blanket, and the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the lament of those struggling to survive. In one of these houses, the most modest of all, lived a family that, like so many others, was facing terribly difficult times. Joao, a 12-year-old boy with curious eyes and brown hair that was always tousled, shared a small room in the attic with his sister Maria, a 10-year-old girl who, despite her young age, already showed wisdom beyond her years. Their days were filled with little adventures around the house, always together, as if they were each other's shadow. The children's father, a lumberjack with calloused hands and a constantly worried expression, spent his days in the forest, trying to make a living from it, which was becoming increasingly scarce. His second wife, a thin woman with a stern look on her face, had joined the family only 2 years ago, after the children's mother died during a particularly cruel winter. Meals, which used to be moments of joy and communion, became silent and tense. The bread, increasingly hard and scarce, was divided into smaller and smaller portions. John and Mary could see the growing despair in the eyes of their father, who could barely look at his children during meals, as if he were carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders. One particularly cold night, when the children should have been asleep, altered voices from downstairs caught their attention. John and Mary, driven by curiosity and fear, quietly descended the attic stairs, taking a seat on the top step where they could hear the conversation without being noticed. "There is no other choice," said the stepmother, her voice a whisper full of determination. "We can't feed 4 mouths. We can barely feed ourselves. If we carry on like this, we'll all starve to death." The father protested weakly, his voice laced with anguish. "They're my children. I can't just— Tomorrow, you'll take them to the deepest part of the forest," she continued, ignoring his protests. "Leave them there. Nature will decide their fate. It's cruel, yes, but it's even crueler to watch them all slowly starve to death." John felt Maria tremble beside him and held her hand tightly. In the darkness of the stairwell, the silent tears of the siblings mingled with the muffled sobs of their father, who finally gave in to the terrible plan. That night, while his sister slept a restless sleep, John stayed awake, his young brain working furiously in search of a solution. The full moon illuminated the room through the small attic window, and it was its glow that gave him an idea. He got up quietly and, picking up a piece of hard bread he had saved from his last meal, began to reduce it to crumbs. The next morning, when their father called them for a walk in the woods, John and Mary exchanged meaningful glances. In his pockets, John carried the crumbs that would be his salvation. Maria, who had always been the more observant of the two, memorized every detail of the path, every peculiar tree, every stone that could serve as a reference. The forest swallowed them deeper and deeper. The father, walking ahead, occasionally wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his worn shirt. John discreetly dropped the breadcrumbs, creating a trail that would guide them back home. Maria squeezed her brother's hand tightly, finding courage in each other's presence. After what seemed like an eternity of walking, they reached a small clearing. The father, in a trembling voice, asked the children to wait there while he searched for firewood nearby. "Don't go anywhere," were his last words before disappearing into the trees, leaving his children alone in the cold, green immensity of the forest. The silence that followed was deafening. John and Mary stood still, listening to the sounds of the forest intensifying around them. The wind whispered among the leaves, birds sang somewhere far away, and small animals ran across the ground covered in dry leaves. "He's not coming back, is he?" whispered Maria, her voice small and frightened. John hugged his sister, trying to convey a confidence he didn't fully feel. "Don't worry," he said. "I've left a trail of crumbs. When it gets dark, we'll be able to follow you back home." But as the hours passed and the sun began to set, a terrible discovery awaited them. Searching for the start of the trail of crumbs, they found only a few bird feathers and no sign of the path they had marked. The birds of the forest, hungry as all get out in that cruel winter, had devoured their only chance of return. Darkness began to approach, bringing with it an even more intense chill and even more threatening sounds. John and Mary, now truly lost in the forest, clung to each other, seeking warmth and comfort. Fear was beginning to settle in their hearts, but along with it, a fierce determination to survive, to find a way, to stay together against all the odds the forest could throw at them. What they didn't know was that their journey had only just begun, and that the dangers of the forest would only be the first of many challenges they would have to face. In the growing darkness, something was watching them, something that had long been waiting for visitors like them, something that would make their quest for survival even more desperate than they could have imagined. Night was rapidly advancing over the forest, bringing with it ever-lengthening and threatening shadows. John and Mary, still hugging each other to protect themselves from the biting cold, began to look for a safe place to spend the night. The boy, trying to keep his composure for the sake of his little sister, scoured the surroundings in search of some natural shelter. "There," exclaimed Maria, pointing to a large fallen tree whose exposed roots formed a kind of natural hollow. It wasn't much, but it offered some protection from the icy wind that was starting to blow harder. The brothers settled into the small space, using dry leaves to create an insulating layer between them and the damp ground. Hunger was beginning to set in, painfully reminding them of why they had been abandoned. John searched his pockets, finding just a few crumbs left over from the bread he had used to mark the way. He carefully shared them with Mary, although they were barely enough to fool his stomach. "John," whispered Maria, her voice trembling slightly, "do you think there are wolves in this forest?" Before John could answer, a distant howl cut through the night air, making them both shrink even further into their makeshift shelter. The boy hugged his sister tighter, feeling his own heart racing. "Don't worry," he replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "They don't usually get close to people." The night seemed endless. The sounds of the forest, once just a backdrop to their little daytime adventures, now seemed amplified and threatening. Every rustle of leaves, every twig snapping under the weight of some nocturnal animal, startled the siblings. Maria eventually fell asleep in her brother's arms, exhausted by the day's walk and the emotional stress. John, however, stayed awake, determined to protect his sister. He watched the dancing shadows cast by the moonlight through the trees, trying to distinguish real threats from tricks played on his increasingly fertile imagination. With the first ray of sunshine, the siblings woke up completely chilled and even hungrier. Their stomachs rumbled painfully, reminding them that they hadn't eaten properly for days. Leaving their night shelter, they started walking in no particular direction, hoping to find some sign of civilization, or at least something edible. "Look," exclaimed John, pointing to a bush laden with small red berries. Maria, however, grabbed his arm before he could reach them. "Wait," she said firmly. "Remember what Mom taught us? Some berries are poisonous." John stepped back, grateful for his sister's caution. His mother had indeed warned them about the dangers of the forest before she died. They continued walking, now more attentive to their surroundings, looking for signs of the fruits and mushrooms that their mother had taught them were safe to eat. The hours dragged by, and the hunger became harder and harder to bear. The sun was already high in the sky when a sweet, irresistible aroma reached them, making their stomachs growl even louder. It was a smell unlike anything they had ever smelled in the forest. Sweet, inviting, almost magical. "Can you smell it?" asked Maria, her nose moving like that of a small rabbit sniffing the air. John nodded, already moving in the direction of the tantalizing aroma. The siblings began to follow the scent, their tired legs finding new energy in the promise of food. As they advanced, the scent grew stronger, and something began to glow among the trees ahead. Pushing aside some low branches, John and Mary emerged into a small clearing and stood paralyzed at the most extraordinary sight they had ever witnessed. There, as if straight out of a dream, was a house, but it was no ordinary house. It was a building made entirely of sweets. The walls were made of gingerbread, decorated with colored candies and icing. The roof was covered in chocolate tiles, and the windows were made of crystallized sugar that sparkled in the sunlight. A path of different colored stones led to the door, and as they got closer, they realized that they were made of drops and hard candies. "This can't be real," muttered Maria, rubbing her eyes as if she expected the vision to disappear. John approached cautiously and touched one of the walls. His fingers sank lightly into the soft honey bread, and he brought a small piece to his mouth. The taste was more delicious than anything he had ever tasted. "It's real," he exclaimed, already plucking another, larger piece from the wall. "Maria, it's all real food." The hunger that tormented them overcame any vestige of caution. The brothers began to devour pieces of the house, alternating between the gingerbread on the walls and the colorful candies that decorated them. The taste was so wonderful, so beyond their expectations, that for a moment they completely forgot their fear and exhaustion. They were so engrossed in their impromptu feast that they didn't notice when the door to the house opened silently. A figure watched them from the threshold, a strange smile forming on its wrinkled face. It was only when a sweet, melodious voice cut through the air that the children realized they were no longer alone. "Well, well," said the voice, making John and Mary freeze in place, their mouths still full of sweets. "What lovely little visitors I have today." The person at the door was a kind-looking lady, dressed in colorful clothes and an immaculate white apron. Her eyes, however, had a strange glint that made John instinctively take a step in front of his sister. "Poor things, you must be starving," the lady continued, opening the door wider in an inviting gesture. "Why don't you come in?" I've got lots more goodies inside, and you look like you could use a nice hot dinner." John and Mary looked at each other, torn between the fear of the unknown and the hunger that had not yet been completely satisfied by the sweets in the house. The lady continued to smile, patiently, as if she had all the time in the world to wait for their decision. What the brothers couldn't know was that, behind that kind smile and the promise of more treats, lurked a danger far greater than anything they had faced so far in the forest. The candy house was just the beginning of an ordeal that would test not only their courage, but also their cunning and, above all, the bond that united them as brothers. The lady stepped forward, and the light coming from inside the house created strange shadows on her wrinkled face. John squeezed Maria's hand, feeling his sister tremble slightly. Hunger, however, spoke louder than fear, and the delicious aroma coming from inside the house was simply irresistible. "Come, come," urged the lady, her voice as sweet as the honey that decorated the walls. "A nice hot soup will do you a lot of good. You're so skinny." With hesitation, the children followed the old woman into the house. The inside was even more impressive than the outside. Candied sugar furniture gleamed under the light of scented candles, and curtains made of caramel threads waved gently. A large wooden table occupied the center of the room, covered with a tablecloth that seemed to be woven from cotton candy. Sit down," said the lady, indicating 2 stools next to the table. "I'm going to prepare something special for you." As she moved around the kitchen, John and Mary observed every detail of the room. Despite its sweet and welcoming appearance, there was something disturbing in the air. On the walls, John noticed strange marks, as if someone had scratched the sweet surface. Maria, for her part, couldn't take her eyes off a large cage in the corner of the room, partially covered by a dark cloth. The lady soon returned with 2 steaming bowls of soup, the aroma of which made the children's stomachs rumble even more. "Eat it all," she said, her eyes shining in a strange way. "You need to get your strength back." The children began to eat greedily, but John noticed that his hostess kept her eyes on them, especially on her fingers, as if she were evaluating them. The soup was delicious, but there was a strange taste that he couldn't identify, something that made his tongue tingle slightly. "What are your names, dears?" asked the lady, taking a seat at the head of the table. "I'm John, and this is my sister Mary," replied the boy, noticing that his voice sounded more slurred than usual. His head was beginning to feel heavy, and the candles seemed to create dancing shapes on the walls. "What lovely names," smiled the lady, but her smile now seemed different, more predatory. "You could call me Griselda." Maria had already finished her soup, and her eyes were beginning to close against her will. John struggled to stay alert, but his limbs felt heavier and heavier. The last thing he saw before succumbing to sleep was Griselda's smile, turning into something terrible, and her eyes glowing with a green, unearthly light. When John woke up, he found himself inside the large cage he had noticed earlier. His hands and feet were tied with ropes made of licorice, and his head was still spinning from the effects of the potion Griselda had put in his soup. Maria was in a separate cage, still unconscious. "Ah, she's finally awake," said Griselda, her voice now completely different from the melodious one that had greeted them. It was harsh and cruel, matching her true appearance, which was now revealed. A witch with long, twisted fingers, a pointed nose and eyes that shone with an ancient malice. "What are you going to do to us?" asked John, trying to keep his voice steady despite the fear he felt. "Oh, my dear," laughed the witch, the sound resembling fingernails scratching a blackboard. "You'll be my dinner, of course. But first, I need to fatten you up a bit. You're too thin for a good meal." At that moment, Maria began to awaken, her eyes widening in horror as she realized her situation. The witch approached her cage, appraising her with critical eyes. The girl first, decided Griselda. Younger children are always more tender. John felt his blood run cold. "No," he shouted, shaking the bars of his cage. "Leave my sister alone." The witch only laughed, a horrible sound that made the sweets on the walls shake. "Don't worry, little one. Your shift will come soon. But first, let's start feeding your little sister properly." Thus began a terrible period for the siblings. The witch forced Mary to eat huge quantities of sweets and treats, while John was fed only hard breadcrumbs. Her plan was clear. She wanted to fatten Mary up first, keeping John too weak to try anything. But the witch didn't count on the children's cunning. During the evenings, when Griselda retired to her room upstairs, John and Mary whispered to each other, planning their escape. Maria had noticed that the witch had very poor eyesight and relied mainly on her sense of smell and touch to guide her. John, for his part, carefully observed the witch's routine, memorizing every detail of her habits. Every morning, Griselda would check on Maria's progress by asking her to extend a finger through the bars of the cage. The witch poked it, grumbling about how the girl was still too thin. What she didn't know was that Maria, following John's idea, had started extending a small chicken bone they had found on the floor of the cage, deceiving the witch about her true state. The days turned into weeks, and the witch's patience began to wear thin. Maria remained thin despite all the food, and John, although weak from lack of food, kept his mind sharp, observing and planning. The children knew they had to act soon, before Griselda realized the trick or decided she had waited long enough. One particularly dark night, while the witch was snoring in her room, John whispered to his sister, "Tomorrow, Maria. Tomorrow we'll try. Remember the plan?" Maria nodded in the darkness, clutching the chicken bone in her hand. "I remember, John, but I'm scared." "I'm scared too," John admitted, "but it's our only chance. We have to outsmart her." The brothers stayed awake for the rest of the night, their hearts beating fast at the prospect of what was to come. The plan was risky, and if they failed, there certainly wouldn't be a second chance. But as John had said, it was their only hope of survival. As the first rays of sunlight began to enter through the crystallized sugar windows, the brothers heard the witch's heavy footsteps coming down the stairs. It was time to put their plan into action and find out if their cunning would be enough to overcome the evil that held them prisoner. The sun had barely risen when Griselda descended the stairs, her heavy footsteps echoing through the candy house. She approached Maria's cage first, as she always did, her eyes emitting that greenish, evil glow. "Good morning, little one," hummed the witch in her fake voice. "Let's see if you're ready for my feast." Maria, trembling slightly, held out the chicken bone through the bars. The witch felt it with her gnarled fingers, frowning in frustration. "Impossible!" exclaimed Griselda, her voice filled with rage. "How can you still be so thin with all that food?" It was at this point that John put the first part of the plan into practice. "Maybe," he said, his voice weak but determined, "she needs something more substantial than sweets." The witch turned to him, puzzled. "Go on," she ordered, her eyes shining with renewed interest. "Our mother always said that roast meat was the best way to put on weight quickly," John continued, praying that his voice didn't betray his nervousness, "especially if it's well seasoned and cooked in the oven." A mischievous smile spread across the witch's wrinkled face. "Yes, yes," she murmured, rubbing her hands together. "That makes sense, and I happen to have an excellent oven." Griselda moved quickly through the kitchen, lighting the large stone oven that took up an entire wall. The flames soon began to crackle, casting dancing shadows across the candy house. "I need to check that it's the right temperature," said the witch, more to herself than to the children. "It has to be perfect." John and Mary exchanged meaningful glances. It was exactly what they had planned. The witch was so engrossed in her preparations that she didn't notice when John started fiddling with the lock of his cage with a piece of wire he had found a few days earlier. "Come here, little girl," Griselda ordered, opening Maria's cage. "I want you to help me check the oven." Maria hesitated, but knew she needed to keep the witch distracted while John worked on her release. She approached the oven with faltering steps, observing the flames that licked the inside of the stone structure. "I can't see properly if it's hot enough," complained the witch, her poor eyes hampering her assessment. "Get in there and tell me how the flames are." Maria took a step back, feigning fear. "I don't know how to do that," she said, her voice trembling. Griselda snorted with impatience. "You fool! Just go in and look. Like this, look." The witch leaned into the oven, demonstrating what she wanted Maria to do. At that very moment, John finally managed to open his cage. With an agility that surprised even him, considering his weakness, he jumped out and ran silently to his sister. The moment the witch was leaning completely over the oven, John and Mary gathered all their strength and pushed her over. Griselda let out a horrifying scream as she fell into the burning oven. Maria quickly closed the heavy iron door, while John locked the bolt. The witch's screams and imprecations echoed through the candy house, making the gingerbread walls shake. The children hugged each other, their hearts beating wildly, as the sounds diminished until they ceased altogether. "We did it," whispered Maria, still hardly believing it. But there was no time for celebration. John was already rummaging through the house, looking for supplies to take with him on his escape. In the kitchen, they found a cloth bag which they filled with bread and dried fruit. Maria discovered a small chest full of gold coins and jewelry, probably stolen from other victims of the witch. "Should we take it?" she asked hesitantly. John considered for a moment before replying, "Yes. We can use it to help our family and other needy people in the village." As they prepared to leave, something extraordinary began to happen. The candy house began to melt and crumble, as if the witch's death had broken some enchantment that kept it standing. Chocolate dripped down the walls, and the crystallized sugar on the windows dissolved like snow in the sun. "Quick!" shouted John, grabbing his sister's hand. "We got to get out of here." The children ran out of the collapsing house, carrying their precious supplies. Behind them, the magical construction had completely melted away, leaving only a giant puddle of melted sweets on the forest floor. The sun was high in the sky now, and for the first time in weeks, John and Mary could feel its rays warming their faces. The forest seemed different, less threatening. It was as if the witch's death had dispelled a dark mist that hung over that part of the forest. "Which way should we go?" asked Maria, looking around. John closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the stories his mother used to tell him about how to find your way around the forest. "Moss always grows on the north side of the trees," he said, "and our village lies to the south of the deep forest." So the brothers began their journey home, stronger and wiser than when they had been abandoned. The weight of the sack of provisions and the treasure chest was barely noticeable, so great was their relief at being free. As they walked, they talked about what they would tell their father, and how they could use the witch's gold to help not only their family, but the whole community that was suffering from hunger. The sun was beginning its descent over the horizon when they spotted a familiar puff of smoke rising above the trees. "It's the chimney of the blacksmith's house," exclaimed Maria, recognizing the pattern of the smoke. The brothers' hearts were filled with renewed hope. They were almost home, but they knew that their adventure had changed their lives forever. They were no longer just two frightened children in the forest. They were survivors who had faced evil and won through their cunning and brotherly love. "Dad, Father," Maria's joyful cries cut through the air as she and John ran towards the little wooden house they knew so well. The woodcutter, who was sitting on a tree stump in front of the house with his face buried in his hands, raised his head when he heard the familiar voices of his children. His eyes, red and swollen from crying, widened in disbelief. In an instant, he was on his feet, running towards the children with open arms. The encounter was an explosion of emotions. Tears, hugs, and words of joy and regret. "My children, my dear children," the father sobbed, clutching them to his chest as if he feared they would disappear again. "Forgive me, please forgive me. I should never have—" "It's all right, Dad," John interrupted, his voice soft and understanding. "We know you had no choice." His stepmother, drawn by the commotion, appeared at the door. Her normally stern face showed signs of surprise and, curiously, relief. In the days since abandoning the children, the weight of her decision had begun to eat away at her conscience. "You've come back," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But how?" Maria and John looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. They decided at that moment that some parts of their story would be better kept secret. After all, who would believe a house made of sweets in an evil witch? "We found help in the forest," replied John diplomatically, adjusting the weight of the bag of provisions on his shoulders. "And we brought something that can help not only our family, but the whole village." Carefully, he opened the sack and showed its contents, first revealing the food they had collected. Then Maria presented the small chest. When she opened it, The glitter of gold and jewels made the adult's eyes widen in amazement. "Mercy!" exclaimed the stepmother, putting her hands to her mouth. "Where did all this come from?" "It's a gift," said Maria firmly, "to help people who are starving." In the weeks that followed, remarkable transformation took place in the small village. The treasure found by the children was used wisely. They bought seeds to plant, animals to raise, and tools to work the land. The father, now freed from the constant worry about immediate survival, was able to devote his time to teaching other families more efficient farming techniques. The stepmother, touched by the generosity of the children she had condemned, changed profoundly. Her heart, previously hardened by bitterness and fear of hunger, began to open. She became a central figure in organizing community efforts, ensuring that no family went without. John and Mary grew up respected in the community, not only for their mysterious good fortune, but above all for the wisdom they showed despite their young age. At night, when the younger children of the village gathered around the fire, they would tell stories, some true, some imagined, about the dangers and wonders of the deep forest. Sometimes, when they were alone, the brothers would talk about their adventure in the candy house. Although the horror of those days never completely left them, they also remembered how that experience had strengthened the bond between them and taught them valuable lessons about courage, cunning, and the importance of trusting each other. "You know, John," Maria said one afternoon, as they watched the sunset from the attic window they still shared, "sometimes I wonder if other lost children found that clearing after the candy house melted." John smiled, taking his sister's hand. "If they did, I hope they only found wild flowers and edible mushrooms. The witch is gone, and with her evil magic." Time passed, and the story of John and Mary became a legend in the village, whispered from generation to generation. It told of two children who faced adversity with courage and came back not only with gold, but with something much more valuable: the wisdom that true treasure lies in the love between siblings and the strength that comes from facing fears together. The winters were still harsh, but the village was now prepared to face them. The families had learned to work together, share resources, and look after each other. And when the snow covered the roofs and the wind howled through the trees, people gathered in their warm homes, telling stories about two brave children who changed the fate of an entire community. John and Mary grew up keeping the memory of their adventure alive, not as a horror story, but as a reminder that even in the darkest of situations, hope and cunning can light the way back home. Night fell over the small town of Pine Grove, Maryland, as Sarah Matthews finished her shift at the local library. Through the old windows of the historic building, the sun was bidding farewell, painting the sky with orange hues that gradually gave way to darkness. At 28, Sarah had become accustomed to the quiet routine of a library, but something about that particular evening made her uneasy. As she organized the last few books on the shelves, her thoughts wandered to the stories that had begun to circulate around the city in recent weeks. Rumors about a half-man, half-goat creature that was terrorizing the most remote areas of the forest surrounding Pine Grove. As a librarian, Sarah had always had a special fascination with urban legends and local folklore, but there was something different about these recent reports. Mark Anderson, her best friend and ranger at the local state park, had shared some disturbing information with her over lunch that day. "Sarah, we found 3 more sites with signs of unexplained activity," he had said, his normally confident voice trembling slightly. "Axe marks on trees, strange footprints, and blood." Sarah put the last book away and picked up her bag, preparing to face the short walk home. Living on the edge of town, her route always included a stretch through the forest. Normally, this never bothered her, but that night, every shadow seemed to hide a thread. As she walked, her mind drifted back to a conversation she'd had with Dr. James Harrison, a retired scientist who frequented the library regularly. He had worked at the local government laboratory for decades before retiring abruptly the previous year. The last time she saw him, he looked troubled, frantically leafing through books on genetics and mutations. "Sometimes, Sarah," he had whispered, "science goes too far. There are things we shouldn't try to understand or control." At the time, she hadn't given his words much weight, but now, Each one echoed in her mind with new meaning. A twig snapped in the darkness, bringing Sarah to an abrupt halt. Her heart raced as her eyes tried to penetrate the density of the forest. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw two red dots shining between the trees, like eyes watching her movements. The next morning, Sarah arrived early at the library, determined to research more about the government laboratory and its history. In her files, she found newspaper clippings dating back a year, reporting the sudden closure of an entire wing of the lab after an unspecified incident. Mark showed up around noon, looking even more worried than the day before. "We found something," he said, placing a photograph on the table. It was a picture of a footprint in the mud, unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. It looked like an impossible mix between a human imprint and a goat's hoof. "That's not all," continued Mark, lowering his voice even further. "Last night, a couple were attacked in the camping area. They managed to escape but described something that shouldn't be there. They talked about red eyes and a scream that sounded both human and animal." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine as she remembered the red dots she had seen the night before. "Mark, I think we need to investigate more about the lab. Dr. Harrison has been acting strangely, and some of the things he said." Before he could finish, the library door opened, and Dr. Harrison himself rushed in. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking as he clutched an old folder. Seeing Sarah and Mark, he hesitated for a moment before approaching. "You need to know the truth," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "What's happening? It's all my fault. We went too far with the experiments. We tried to create something we shouldn't have, and now," his voice faltered. Sarah and Mark exchanged worried glances as Dr. Harrison opened the folder, revealing classified documents and old photographs of the lab. It was a secret project, he continued, focused on genetic improvement. "We started with animals, trying to create more resistant hybrids. But then, a sudden clap of thunder made everyone jump. A storm was approaching, and through the windows of the library, they could see dark clouds gathering rapidly." Dr. Harrison looked increasingly agitated. "He's out there," he muttered, glancing nervously at the windows. "My creation, my mistake. And now he's hunting. I can no longer control what we've created." Sarah felt her world spin as she absorbed the information. The urban legends, the attacks, the rumors, it was all starting to make terrible sense. Something had escaped from the lab, something that wasn't supposed to exist, and was now loose in the forests of Maryland. Mark put a comforting hand on her shoulder, but his eyes reflected the same fear she felt. As the storm approached and premature darkness took over the sky, the three of them remained silent in the library, each lost in their own dark thoughts about what awaited them in the coming hours. The distant sound of a scream, not quite human, not quite animal, echoed through the walls of the library, causing everyone to freeze. The creature was approaching the city, and they were the only ones who knew the truth about its origin. Now, they had to decide what to do with this information before more people became victims of the experiment that had gone horribly wrong. Dr. Harrison spread the documents out on the library table, his hands still shaking as he organized the photographs and reports. Sarah and Mark leaned over to examine the material, trying to ignore the distant sounds of the approaching storm. The black and white photographs showed sterile laboratory facilities and a series of reinforced cages that seemed designed to contain something much bigger and stronger than an ordinary goat. "The project started 15 years ago," explained Harrison, his voice low and hoarse. "At first, it was just basic research into genetic improvement in goats. We wanted to create animals that were more resistant, that could produce more milk, more meat. But then, he ran his fingers over a photograph showing a team of scientists in white lab coats. Then we discovered something extraordinary in the DNA of the goats." Sarah picked up one of the reports, her eyes roaming over the technical notes. "A protein that allowed accelerated cellular adaptation," she read aloud, frowning. "Exactly," confirmed Harrison. "We thought we could use this characteristic to develop revolutionary treatments, cures for degenerative diseases, tissue regeneration. The possibilities seemed endless." He paused, running his hand over his tired face. "But we needed a test subject closer to humans." Mark, who had been silent until then, looked up from the documents. You didn't? Yes, Harrison interrupted, his voice breaking. We use human DNA. At first, it was just cells in the lab, but the results were too impressive to ignore. The Pentagon increased our funding, and the pressure for results was constant. A particularly loud clap of thunder rattled the windows of the library. Sarah noticed that the temperature had dropped considerably, and a howling wind was starting to blow outside. Dr. Reynolds was our chief scientist, Harrison continued, pointing to a tall, thin man in the photograph. He was obsessed with the project. He would spend whole days in a lab, sleeping only a few hours. And then he hesitated, swallowing. Then he volunteered for the first human test. Sarah felt her stomach turn. He injected the modified DNA into himself. Harrison nodded slowly. At first it seemed to have worked. His physical strength increased exponentially. His stamina was extraordinary. But then the changes began. First it was small things, changes in the texture of your skin, changes in the timbre of your voice. We tried to stop the process, but it was too late. Mark stood up abruptly, walking over to the window. The storm was now upon them, and the rain was starting to fall heavily. How long until he transforms completely? 3 days, replied Harrison, his voice only a whisper. On the 3rd day, he broke containment. He killed 2 security guards before fleeing into the forest. The government buried everything, classified the files, closed the lab. But he's out there, and every day that passes, a distant scream cut through the air, closer than the previous one. Sarah felt her hair stand on end as she recognized the grotesque mixture of human and animal sound. He's getting bolder, said Harrison, putting the documents back in his briefcase. At first, he kept his distance from populated areas, but the transformation continues. More and more, the human mind gives way to animal instincts. Sarah picked up her phone, checking the local news. 3 attacks in the last week, she reported. All close to the city. People are starting to notice a pattern. Mark returned to the table, his face determined. We need to do something. We can't let any more people get hurt. There's something I haven't told you, said Harrison, hesitantly. In the last experiments before the incident, we developed a serum that could theoretically reverse the process. It's never been tested, but where is it? Asked Sarah, leaning forward. In the laboratory, in the same building where it all happened. It's locked away in a special freezer in the basement. A flash of lightning lit up the library, followed immediately by a deafening clap of thunder. The lights flickered on and off, leaving them in semi-darkness. The emergency generator hummed, and a few security lights came on, creating unsettling shadows on the shelves. We need that serum, said Mark, his voice firm despite the fear evident in his eyes. It's our only chance of stopping this. Sarah nodded, although her heart was racing. The lab is less than an hour away. If we go now, Harrison shook his head vehemently. It's too dangerous. He knows that place. He probably uses it as territory. And with this storm, another scream echoed through the night, this time so close that it seemed to come from across the street. The 3 of them instinctively moved closer, looking out of the library window into the darkness outside. The rain beat down on the deserted streets, and the street lamps created small circles of illumination in the stormy night. We have no choice, said Sarah, picking up her bag. More people are going to die if we don't do something. Dr. Harrison, we need you to guide us to the lab. The elderly scientist looked terrified, but after a moment's hesitation, he nodded slowly. There's an entrance at the back, through the underground parking lot. I could take us there, but he glanced nervously out of the window. They'll know we're coming. Mark checked his cell phone. I've got emergency equipment in my Jeep. Flashlights, ropes, first aid kit. If we leave now, we can get there before the storm gets any worse. Sarah began to gather up the documents, carefully storing them in her waterproof bag. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but her determination was greater than her fear. They had a chance to fix something that had gone terribly wrong, to stop more lives being lost. As they prepared to leave, the sound of breaking glass echoed through the empty library building. Everyone froze. The noise came from upstairs, where the rare work section was located. Heavy, jagged footsteps could be heard above their heads. followed by the distinctive sound of claws scratching the wooden floor. Sarah, Mark, and Dr. Harrison stood paralyzed, staring at the ceiling as the sounds above them continued. The creaking of the wooden floorboards indicated that the creature was moving slowly, as if sniffing something out. Harrison put a finger to his lips, signaling for them to remain absolutely silent. "The back door," whispered Mark so low it was almost inaudible. "If we go slowly." Before he could finish, a deafening noise came from upstairs, the sound of bookshelves being knocked over and books scattering across the floor. Sarah grabbed her bag with the documents, and the three of them began to move silently towards the emergency exit. The sound of the pouring rain partially masked their footsteps, but every movement seemed dangerously loud in their ears. When they reached the back door, Mark opened it slowly, trying to prevent the old hinges from creaking. The cold wind and rain hit them immediately. A furious scream echoed inside the library. The creature had sensed their presence. The sound was even more terrifying up close, a grotesque mixture of human scream and animal bleat that made their bones freeze. "Run!" shouted Mark, pushing Sarah and Harrison out. They shot through the rain towards Mark's jeep, which was parked about 50 meters away. Sarah could hear sounds of destruction coming from the library, glass breaking, furniture being thrown. The creature was coming down. They arrived at the vehicle soaking wet. Mark unlocked the doors with trembling hands while Sarah helped Harrison into the back seat. When she turned to get into the passenger side, her blood ran cold. Standing at the entrance to the library, illuminated by a flash of lightning, was the creature. It was taller than a normal man, with grotesquely deformed legs ending in hooves. Its torso was a disturbing mixture of human and goat features, covered in a dark, patchy coat. But most frightening were his eyes, two glowing red orbs that seemed to burn in the darkness. "My God," whispered Harrison. "Reynolds." The creature turned its head towards them, its eyes fixed on the elderly scientist. For a moment, something akin to recognition flashed across its deformed face. Then, with a deafening roar, it began to run towards them. Mark turned the key in the ignition and the engine roared to life. He shifted in a gear and floored the accelerator, causing the tires to spin on the wet asphalt before they could gain traction. The jeep shot down the main street of Pine Grove, with the creature in hot pursuit. "He's too fast," shouted Sarah, looking in a rearview mirror. The creature moved impossibly fast, alternating between 2 and 4 legs, leaping over obstacles with supernatural agility. "The lab is to the east, down the old forest road," instructed Harrison, clinging to the seat as Mark made a sharp turn. The storm was getting worse by the minute. Lightning continuously cut across the sky, briefly turning night into day. The rain was so heavy that the windshield wipers were barely able to keep up. "We need to lose him," said Mark, concentrating on the steering. "Sarah, there's a flare gun in the glove compartment. When I tell you," a violent impact shook the jeep. The creature had reached the vehicle and jumped over the bucket. Metal claws scratched the roof, and a monstrous face appeared in the window next to Sarah, who screamed and threw herself away. Mark made a sudden maneuver, throwing the jeep into some trees by the side of the road. The creature lost its balance and fell, rolling in the mud. But before they could celebrate, they saw its form rise and resume the chase. "There," pointed out Harrison. "That entrance on the right leads to the back of the lab." Mark turned sharply, entering an almost invisible dirt road between the trees. The jeep shook violently as they drove along the abandoned road, branches banging against the bodywork. "He's not behind us anymore," observed Sarah, tense. "That's not good," replied Harrison. "He knows this place better than we do. He's probably taking another route." After a few minutes of tense driving, they came to a high fence with barbed wire. Beyond it, partially hidden by vegetation, was a complex of low, gray buildings. "The main gate must be locked," said Harrison, "but there's a gap in the fence near the abandoned guard post." Mark parked the jeep near the spot indicated. The rain had eased a little, but thunder still echoed in the distance. They got out of the vehicle, Mark grabbing his backpack with equipment. "The serum is in Lab C, underground," Harrison explained as they walked towards a gap in the fence. "We need to get there," and a branch snapped in the darkness to their right. Everyone stopped, tense. For a moment, Only the sound of rain and wind in the trees could be heard. Then 2 red dots flashed between the shadows. "It's surrounding us," whispered Mark. The creature slowly emerged from the darkness, its monstrous body dripping with rainwater. It was less than 10 meters away from them, blocking the way to the laboratory. For the first time, they could clearly see the bloody axe in its hand, an ordinary tool transformed into a lethal weapon. Reynolds called out Harrison, stepping forward. "I know you're still in there. We can help. We have a way to reverse it." The creature tilted its head, as if processing the words. For a moment, its posture seemed less threatening. Then, its red eyes focused on the partially visible documents in Sarah's bag, and a roar of fury escaped from its deformed throat. "He doesn't want to be cured," Sarah realized with horror. "He wants to destroy any evidence of what happened here." The creature advanced, raising its axe. Mark pushed Sarah and Harrison back, frantically searching for something in his backpack. Time seemed to slow down as rain fell and lightning illuminated the grotesque scene before them. 3 humans trapped by something that shouldn't exist, something born of unbridled scientific ambition. The axe cut through the air with a deadly hiss, and the night was filled with screams of terror and bestial fury. The creature's axe met only air as Mark managed to pull Sarah and Harrison back at the last second. Taking advantage of the monster's moment of imbalance, Mark pulled a flare from his backpack and fired it directly into its glowing red eyes. The intense light made the creature cry out in pain and recoil, giving them a few precious seconds. "This way," shouted Harrison, guiding them through a narrow passage between 2 buildings. The rain continued to fall, turning the ground into slippery mud as they ran toward a side entrance to Lab C. Sarah clutched her document bag tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of the creature recovering, a mixture of furious roars and hooves pounding against the wet concrete. Harrison stopped in front of a metal door with an electronic panel. His hands were shaking as he typed in a sequence of numbers. "I hope it still works," he muttered. To his relief, a green light flashed and the door unlocked with a metallic click. Being her quickly, Mark closing the door behind them. The inside of the lab was dark and cold, lit only by the dim emergency light. The air smelled acridly of chemicals and abandonment. "The emergency generator must still be working," said Harrison, leading them down a corridor. "The freezer with the serum needs constant power." A deafening crash echoed through the building. The creature had found another entrance. The sound of metal being twisted and glass breaking indicated that it was destroying everything in its path to reach them. "This way," whispered Harrison, opening a door that led to a staircase. "The basement is a maze of corridors. We can use that to our advantage." They descended the stairs as quietly as possible, their shadows dancing on the walls in the dim light of the emergency lamps. The basement was even colder, and Sarah could see their breath forming little clouds in the air. "That thing," said Mark as they advanced down a corridor full of abandoned equipment, "does it still have any human consciousness?" Harrison hesitated before answering. Reynolds has always been intense, obsessed with his work. The physical transformation was only part of the change. His mind altered too, but in ways we don't fully understand. A distorted scream echoed through the corridors, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs. The creature had followed them underground. "There," Harrison pointed to a double door at the end of the corridor. "That's the main lab. The freezer's in there." They ran to the door, but it was locked. Harrison started typing in another code while Mark prepared his last beacon. Sarah nervously watched the corridor, her ears attentive to every sound. The door finally opened, revealing a large laboratory full of sophisticated equipment covered in plastic. Harrison rushed over to a large industrial freezer in the corner of the room. "The serum must be in here," he said, pulling out a metal drawer. "I put it here myself." He held up a small bottle containing a bluish liquid. At the same moment, the creature appeared in the doorway of the laboratory, its monstrous form framed by the dim light of the corridor. "Reynolds," Harrison called out, his voice trembling. "Look at what you've become. This isn't what we wanted. Let us help." The creature stepped forward, its red eyes fixed on the vial. For a moment, Something akin to hesitation flashed across its deformed face. Then, with a sudden movement, it threw the axe. "Look out!" shouted Mark, pushing Harrison aside. The axe skimmed past, hitting the freezer and causing several vials to shatter. Sarah took advantage of the distraction to run to a side bench, looking for something she could use as a weapon. She found a fire extinguisher and threw it at Mark, who caught it in midair. The creature advanced, but Mark activated the extinguisher, creating a dense cloud of chemical powder. The monster retreated, coughing and growling, momentarily blinded. "The serum," shouted Sarah. "We need a syringe." Harrison frantically opened drawers until he found a box of sterilized syringes. With trembling hands, he began to prepare the serum while Mark kept the creature at bay with the fire extinguisher. "Even if we manage to inject it into him," said Mark, "how do we know it will work?" "We don't know," replied Harrison, his voice laden with guilt. "But it's our only chance." The creature began to recover, its red eyes glowing with fury through the chemical mist. With a deafening roar, it advanced again, knocking over equipment and tables in its path. Sarah realized that they needed a better plan than simply trying to inject the serum by force. Looking around the lab, an idea began to form in her mind. Dangerous, but perhaps her only option. "Dr. Harrison," she said, without taking her eyes off the creature, "those tanks in a corner. What's in them?" "Liquid nitrogen," he replied, "for preserving samples." "Mark," Sarah called out, "when I tell you, drop the extinguisher and run for the door." The creature was getting closer and closer, its movements calculated like a predator circling its prey. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that they would only have one chance to make this work. Time seemed to slow down as she watched the scene before her. Harrison with the syringe ready, Mark keeping the creature at bay, and the monster that had once been Dr. Reynolds ready to pounce. The decision they made in the next few seconds would determine not only their lives, but also the fate of something that should never have existed. "Now," shouted Sarah, and Mark immediately dropped the fire extinguisher, running for the door. The creature, focused on its closest prey, advanced towards them. It was exactly what Sarah had expected. With one swift movement, she grabbed one of the tubes of liquid nitrogen and hurled it against the floor next to the creature's feet. The impact shattered the container, releasing a dense cloud of cryogenic vapor. The monster roared in pain as the supercooled liquid hit its legs, instantly freezing its fur and exposed skin. Harrison seized the opportunity, rushing over with syringe in hand. The creature, partially immobilized by the pain and intense cold, was unable to defend itself in time. The scientist stuck the needle into its neck, injecting the bluish serum. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the creature began to convulse violently. Its red eyes flashed like faulty light bulbs, and a guttural sound, more human than animal, escaped from its throat. "Is it working?" asked Mark, still near the door. "I don't know," replied Harrison, backing away slowly. The original transformation process took days. The reversal could be just as... His words were interrupted by an agonized scream from the creature. Its body began to undergo visible changes, the fur falling off in clumps, the muscles contracting and reorganizing under the skin. It was a grotesque sight, like a nightmare unraveling in slow motion. Sarah noticed something worrying. The nitrogen vapor was dissipating, and the creature was beginning to regain mobility. "We need to contain it somehow," she shouted. Mark ran to a supply closet and started throwing cables and ropes to Sarah. Together, they tried to bind the creature as it struggled on the floor, caught between two forms, neither fully human nor fully animal. "Reynolds," Harrison called out, approaching cautiously. "If you can hear me, you need to fight. Remember who you are." The creature stopped struggling for a moment, its eyes, now alternating between red and a more human tone, focused on the older scientist's face. A strange sound escaped from its throat, as if it were trying to form words. "That's right," Harrison encouraged. "You're Dr. Thomas Reynolds. Remember the lab, our work. Remember who you were before." A sudden bang shook the building, and the emergency lights flickered. The generator was failing. "If we lose power," Harrison said urgently, "all the containment systems in the lab will fail, including the ones holding other..." Experiments? Sarah felt a chill at the thought of what else might be stored in the depths of that place. Mark, go check the generator. There should be a control room nearby. Mark nodded and ran off, leaving Sarah and Harrison with the transforming creature. The process seemed to be speeding up now, the hose slowly splitting into fingers, the face reshaping itself into more human features. Suddenly, a siren began to sound throughout the lab. Red warning lights flashed in the corridors and a computerized voice announced, "Attention, critical systems failure. Containment protocol compromised. Initiating self-destruct sequence in 10 minutes. No, shouted Harrison. The lab has a final safety system. If it detects total failure, it will incinerate everything to prevent contamination. Mike came running back. The generator is dead. I found the control panel, but it's all in code. Harrison looked at the creature, then at his companions. Go, he said. I'll stay with Reynolds. I could try to cancel the sequence. I know the codes. We're not leaving you, Sarah protested. A guttural sound came from the creature, now more man than monster. Go, said a hoarse, distorted voice. It was the first clearly human word they had heard from it. Harrison took the documents from Sarah's bag. Take these. Tell the world what happened here. But now run. Sarah hesitated for a moment, but Mark pulled her by the arm. Together, they ran through the dark corridors of the underground while the mechanical voice continued its countdown. They made it to the surface just as a violent tremor shook the building. Flames began to rise from the laboratory windows, and a series of controlled explosions began the systematic destruction of the complex. Sarah and Mark watched helplessly as the lab was consumed by fire. There was no sign of Harrison or Reynolds. The rain had stopped, and the sky was beginning to lighten on the horizon, heralding the dawn. Do you think they? Began Sarah, but she couldn't finish the question. Mark put an arm around her shoulders. Harrison knew what he was doing. Maybe this was the only way to really put things right. In the days that followed, the authorities classified the incident as an industrial accident. The documents that Sarah and Mark saved were published anonymously, sparking heated debates about ethics in scientific research. The attacks in the Maryland forests ceased completely. Occasionally, on the darkest nights, some residents would swear they heard strange sounds coming from the forest. Not quite human, not quite animal. But now, these sounds sounded more like a mournful wail than a menacing roar. Sarah returned to her work in the library, but something had changed. Among the books on legends and folklore, she had set aside a special section to document the case of the Maryland hybrid. Not as a monster, but as a warning about the dangers of playing with forces beyond our comprehension. And on stormy nights, when the wind howled through the trees, she wondered if somewhere in the depths of the forest, two men, a scientist and his creation, had finally found peace. The mist crept across the green fields of Ireland as Sarah O'Connor put the last cup of tea on the silver tray that had belonged to her family for generations. The old O'Connor house, built in the 18th century, creaked under the weight of the years and the stories it held in its stone walls. Sarah, a 23-year-old with flame-colored hair and eyes as green as the Irish hills, had returned to the family estate after 5 years studying in Dublin. The reason for her return was not the happiest. Her grandfather, Patrick O'Connor, was ill. The doctors had given him just a few weeks to live, and Sarah felt she had to be there for him in his last moments. Patrick wasn't just her grandfather. He was the guardian of old family traditions and the last living link to her late mother, who had died when Sarah was just 12. As she climbed the stairs to her grandfather's room, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was different that morning. The air seemed thicker, charged with an invisible electricity that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The old tapestries on the walls seemed to whisper forgotten stories, and the wind blowing through the gaps in the windows produced a sound reminiscent of a distant lament. "How are you feeling today, Grandpa?" asked Sarah, entering the large room where Patrick lay in his canopy bed. The old man, still maintaining his dignified posture, smiled weakly at his granddaughter. "Ah, M.O. Store, you know the O'Connors are as tough as the stones in this house," he replied, his voice hoarse but still carrying the distinctive Irish country accent. but I need to tell you something important. Sit here." Sarah placed the tray on the side table and sat on the edge of the bed. It was then that she noticed something peculiar. On the bedside table was an antique silver comb that she had never seen before. Her grandfather followed her gaze, and his expression became grave. "It was your grandmother who gave me this comb," Patrick explained, "and before her, it belonged to your great-grandmother. It's more than just a family heirloom, Sarah. It's a sign." "A sign?" Sarah frowned, feeling a shiver run down her spine. "The women in our family have always had a special gift," Patrick continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Some can see beyond the veil that separates this world from the next. Your mother had this gift, as did your grandmother before her." Sarah felt her heart race. She had always known that there was something different about her family, especially after her mother's death. On that fateful night, she swore she heard a supernatural scream, a wail that seemed to carry all the sadness in the world. "You're talking about the banshees, aren't you?" Sarah asked, finally verbalizing what her heart already knew. The old stories her mother used to tell her came back to her mind like a whirlwind. Patrick nodded slowly. "The Bean City are more than legends, M.O. Store. They are the messengers between worlds, and some ancient families, like ours, share a special bond with them." It was at that moment that an icy wind swept through the room, making the curtains dance violently. The silver comb on the nightstand vibrated slightly, and Sarah could have sworn she heard a distant whisper, as if someone was singing an ancient Gaelic melody. "The gift is passing to you now, Sarah," said Patrick, holding his granddaughter's hand with surprising strength. "You will begin to see and hear things that others cannot. It's both a blessing and a responsibility." Sarah felt the weight of those words settle on her shoulders. Memories of strange events throughout her life began to make sense. The voices she sometimes heard in the wind, the shadows she saw out of the corner of her eye, the inexplicable sense of presence that had accompanied her since she was a child. "But why now, Grandpa?" "Because the time has come," he replied with a sad smile. "The banshees don't just appear to announce death. They're guardians of the old Irish families. And now, you must take on that role of guardian in our family." Distant thunder echoed across the fields, and Sarah noticed that the mist outside had become thicker, almost supernatural. In the reflection of the window, for a brief moment, she thought she saw a long-haired female figure dressed in green, but when she blinked, the image had disappeared. "What should I do?" asked Sarah, her voice trembling slightly. "Accept who you are," replied Patrick. "The silver comb is yours now. It will help you to see more clearly, to understand your gift. But remember, with great power comes great responsibility. The banshees are not merely messengers of death. They are protectors of ancient bloodlines, guardians of secrets that go back to the earliest days of Ireland." Sarah picked up the silver comb, feeling its weight and the ancient energy emanating from it. The moment her fingers touched the cold metal, a series of images flashed through her mind. Long-haired women dancing in the moonlight, ancient ceremonies in stone circles, laments that echoed through the centuries. The day progressed, and with it, Sarah felt a deeper understanding of her legacy growing inside her. The shadows in the room seemed denser, more alive, and she could swear she heard whispers in an ancient, forgotten language. Her grandfather watched her with a mixture of pride and concern, knowing that the path that lay before her would not be easy. "There's a lot more you need to learn," said Patrick, his voice growing weaker. "Time is running out, and there are secrets that need to be revealed. But first, you must fully accept who you are and what you are destined to become." The mist outside had turned into an impenetrable curtain, and the wind now carried a sound that Sarah could no longer ignore, a distant, ancestral wail, calling her to a destiny she was only just beginning to understand. Dusk was approaching when Sarah finally left her grandfather's room. Her hands were still shaking as she clutched the silver comb, which seemed to pulse with an energy of its own. As she walked down the stairs of the mansion, each step echoed differently, as if the house itself was responding to her newly awakened presence. In the old kitchen, Sarah made more tea, trying to process everything her grandfather had revealed. His words about his gift and the connection with the banshees reverberated in her mind. Memories of her childhood began to emerge in a new light. The stories her mother told her weren't just bedtime stories. They were preparations for this moment. A sudden movement by the window caught her eye. In the laundry area outside, the clothes hanging on the clothesline were dancing violently, even though the air was strangely still. Sarah approached the window and her heart almost stopped. Between the white sheets, there was a female figure with long dark hair, dressed in shades of green, washing something that looked like a bloody garment. "It can't be," Sarah whispered, her hands clenching the windowsill. The figure slowly raised its head, its eyes meeting Sarah's. There was no malice in that look, just a deep, old sadness. The phone rang abruptly, breaking the moment. When Sarah looked out again, the figure had disappeared, leaving only the sheets swaying gently in the evening breeze. Her hands shook as she answered the phone. "Sarah, it's Dr. Murphy." The familiar voice of the family doctor sounded on the other end of the line. "I'm on my way to check on your grandfather. The latest tests have arrived, and we need to discuss a few things." "Of course, doctor," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll be waiting." After hanging up, Sarah climbed the stairs again, each step seeming heavier than the last. The silver comb in her pocket seemed to warm up, as if responding to something she couldn't yet fully understand. In the corridor leading to her grandfather's room, the family portraits on the walls seemed to be watching her more intensely. Sarah stopped in front of the photograph of her mother, taken a few months before her death. Now, with her new understanding, she could see something in her eyes that she had never noticed before, an ancient wisdom, a deep knowledge of things that existed beyond the veil of ordinary reality. "You knew, didn't you, Mom?" murmured Sarah to the portrait. "I knew what happened to me." A soft sound, like the strumming of a harp, floated down the corridor. Sarah closed her eyes, allowing the melody to envelop her. It was an old tune, a Gaelic song her mother used to sing, but there was something different about it now, a supernatural quality that made her heart squeeze. Dr. Murphy arrived shortly afterwards, carrying a folder full of tests and that professional air that masked concern. Sarah led her into her grandfather's room, noticing how the doctor shivered slightly as she entered. "It's colder in here today," commented Dr. Murphy, adjusting her coat. Sarah just nodded, knowing that the cold had nothing to do with the actual temperature of the room. While the doctor examined her grandfather, Sarah watched the shadows in the corners of the room, which seemed to move in impossible ways. "Sarah," called her grandfather after the examination, his voice weaker than before. "Open the top drawer of the dresser. There's something else you need to see." With trembling hands, Sarah opened the indicated drawer. Inside was an old book, bound in worn green leather, with Celtic symbols engraved on the cover. As she touched it, she felt the same energy emanating from the silver comb. "It's your grandmother's diary," Patrick explained. "She recorded everything she knew about our gift, about the banshees. It will help you better understand what's to come." Dr. Murphy watched the scene with a curious expression, as if she could sense that something important was happening, even if she didn't understand exactly what. "Mr. O'Connor, we need to adjust your medication," she said, breaking the moment. "And Sarah, can we talk outside for a moment?" In the corridor, the doctor was blunt. "Sarah, I'm sorry, but your grandfather is getting worse faster than we expected. I suggest you get ready." The doctor's words were interrupted by a distant sound, a wailing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Dr. Murphy looked around, confused, but it was clear that only Sarah could really hear it in all its intensity. "Did you hear something?" asked the doctor. "Just the wind," Sarah lied, feeling the weight of the book in her hands and the comb in her pocket. She knew that this lament was only the beginning, that her real test was yet to come. When the doctor left, Sarah took refuge in the house's library, lighting only an old lamp. She opened her grandmother's diary with reverence, the yellowed pages exuding a scent of history and secrets. The first words leapt off the page as if they had a life of their own. "To the one who comes after me, know that the gift is not a curse, but a sacred responsibility. The banshees are not just messengers of death. They are guardians of the balance between the worlds. And now, dear granddaughter, it is your turn to carry this burden." Sarah ran her fingers over the words written in elegant calligraphy, feeling a deep connection with her grandmother, whom she had never met. Outside, the mist continued to thicken, and the distant wail of the banshees echoed through the approaching night, beckoning her to a destiny that was only just beginning to unfold. As Sarah immersed herself in the pages of her grandmother's diary, the wind outside the manor increased its intensity. The handwritten words revealed ancient secrets about the banshees and their connection to the O'Connor family. Each page brought with it a new understanding of the gift that now flowed through her veins. The banshees choose their confidants carefully. One passage read, "Not all the women in the family are chosen, only those with the strength to carry the burden of knowledge between the worlds." A sudden noise of breaking glass upstairs snapped Sarah out of her reading. Her heart raced when she realized it was coming from her grandfather's room. Running up the stairs, she found Patrick sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the now broken window. "Grandpa, are you all right?" she asked, hurrying over to him. "They're coming in greater numbers," he replied, his voice carrying a serenity that contrasted with the situation. "The more noble we are in life, the more banshees accompany us on the passage." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine as she noticed 3 ethereal figures outside the broken window, dressed in shades of green and white. Their long hair danced in the air as if they were underwater. Their faces, although beautiful, carried an ancient sadness. "Don't be afraid," said Patrick, holding his granddaughter's hand. "They are here to honor our family and to guide you in your new role." The silver comb in Sarah's pocket began to vibrate more intensely. When she took it out, she noticed that it shone with a light of its own, silver like moonlight. The banshees outside seemed to react to her presence, their wails becoming more melodious. "Use it," instructed Patrick. "The comb is a bridge between worlds. Through it, you'll be able to understand them better." With trembling hands, Sarah lifted the comb. The 3 figures floated closer to the broken window, their eyes fixed on the object. As Sarah ran the comb through her own red hair, a wave of sensations and images invaded her mind. She saw generations of O'Connor women before her, each carrying the same gift, the same burden. She saw her mother, young and radiant, talking to the same creatures who were now watching her. She saw her grandmother, writing in her journal by candlelight, while shadows danced on the walls around her. "They have something to show you," said Patrick, his breathing becoming more labored. "Go with them, M.O.'s store. Learn what you need to learn." As if responding to his words, one of the banshees extended her translucent hand through the broken window. Sarah hesitated for a moment, but something inside her knew that this was her destiny. She touched the creature's hand and felt herself being pulled into a different reality. The world around her was transformed. She was still in her grandfather's room, but it was like seeing through a veil of mist. The walls seemed to breathe, and she could see threads of golden energy connecting all the objects. The 3 banshees now seemed more solid, more real. "Welcome to the in-between place," said one of them in Old Gaelic, which Sarah surprisingly understood. "Here, worlds touch, and secrets are revealed to those who can see." The creatures began to show Sarah how reality was much more complex than she had imagined. There were layers upon layers of existence, and the banshees navigated between them, keeping the balance and guiding the souls that needed to cross over. "Your gift is not just to hear our laments or to see us," explained another banshee. "It's understanding the web that connects all things. It's being a guardian of the balance between worlds." Through this new perception, Sarah could see the threads of life that connected her grandfather to the material world slowly unraveling, while other, brighter threads began to form, extending into the beyond. "His time is almost up," said the 3rd banshee. "But before the passing happens, you need to fully accept your role. The gift is in your blood, but the choice to embrace it is yours." Sarah looked at her grandfather, who seemed to be sleeping peacefully in bed. In between, she could see a golden aura around him, pulsating like a heart. The memories of his entire life were there, shining like stars in a complex web of events and choices. "How can I be sure I'm ready?" asked Sarah, her voice echoing strangely in this altered reality. "The gift was already inside you from the beginning," replied the 1st banshee. "Every time you felt something you couldn't explain, Every time you heard music in the wind or saw shadows dancing, it was your gift manifesting. Now is just the time to consciously accept what you have always been. Sarah closed her eyes, letting all the inexplicable memories of her life finally make sense. The silver comb in her hands pulsed with ancient energy, connecting her even more deeply with her legacy. When she opened her eyes again, she was back in her normal room, but her perception had changed forever. She could see the banshees clearly now, without needing the veil of the in-between place, and she understood their role with a clarity she had never had before. "Did you see what you needed to see?" asked Patrick, his voice getting weaker and weaker. "Yes, Grandpa," replied Sarah, holding his hand. "Now I understand what it means to be a guardian." The three banshees stood outside the window, their wails now forming a harmony that spoke of farewell and renewal. Sarah knew that she was witnessing not only the end of a life, but also the beginning of her true journey as the heir to an ancestral legacy. The night wore on as Sarah remained by her grandfather's side, watching his breathing become weaker and weaker. The three banshees continued their silent vigil, their ethereal bodies emanating a soft light that illuminated the room with shades of green and silver. Her grandmother's diary rested on her lap, its pages still revealing secrets she needed to absorb. "There's something else I need to tell you," Patrick whispered, his voice so low that Sarah had to lean in to hear him. "About your mother, about the night she left." Sarah felt her heart squeeze. That night had always been a painful mystery in her life, surrounded by unanswered questions and hazy memories. "Your mother didn't die by accident, as everyone thinks," Patrick continued, his eyes fixed on a distant point. "She chose to sacrifice herself to maintain the balance between the worlds." There was an ancient prophecy. Before he could finish, a stronger gust of wind blew through the room, making the curtains dance violently. A fourth banshee appeared, different from the others. Her dress was blood red, and her eyes glowed with an intensity that made Sarah instinctively recoil. "The Morrigan," murmured Patrick, recognizing the figure. "The Queen of Ghosts." The newcomer floated over to the bed, her movements as graceful as flowing water. The other banshees bowed their heads in respect, their wails turning into an ancient chant that Sarah recognized from her mother's stories. "Young guardian," spoke Morrigan, his voice reverberating not only in the air, but inside Sarah's own mind. "Your mother's sacrifice was not in vain. She was protecting something far more precious than her own life." Sarah gripped the silver comb tighter, feeling it vibrate in tune with the presence of the powerful entity. "What was she protecting?" "The seal between the worlds," replied Morrigan. "There are places in Ireland where the veil is thinner, where the barriers between reality and dream break down. Your family has always been guardians of one of these portals, hidden deep within this estate." Patrick coughed weakly, attracting everyone's attention. "The circle of stones in the woods behind the house." "Sarah, you need to rest now, noble guardian," interrupted Morrigan, laying a spectral hand on Patrick's forehead. "Your granddaughter will understand when the time comes." Sarah watched her grandfather relax under the entity's touch, his features softening. The other banshees began to move in a slow circle around the bed, their dresses and hair floating as if they were submerged. "The stone circle," thought Sarah, remembering the place she had always been forbidden to visit as a child. Her mother always said it was dangerous, that there were ancient things sleeping there that shouldn't be disturbed. Morrigan turned her attention to Sarah. "The portal is weakening. Without a guardian, the barriers will begin to crumble. You must complete your initiation before it's too late." "But how? I don't know what to do. I'm not ready." "Knowledge is in your blood," replied Morrigan. "The comb will show you the way, and your grandmother's diary contains the necessary words. But it must be done tonight, during the moment between worlds." Sarah opened the diary, her hands trembling slightly. On the last pages, she found a ritual described in detail, written with an urgency that seemed to leap from the paper. It was an ancient ceremony, meant to seal the bond between a guardian and the forces she was meant to protect. "You will have to choose," Morgan said, "just as your mother chose. Power comes with a price, always." The room began to spin slightly around Sarah, the walls seeming to breathe with a life of their own. Through the broken window, she could see the moon rising in the sky, its silver light bathing the landscape in spectral hues. Patrick opened his eyes one last time, meeting his granddaughter's gaze. "Emo Store, trust your heart. The O'Connor blood is strong in you." Sarah held her grandfather's hand, feeling it grow colder and colder. The banshees intensified their singing, creating a melody that seemed to weave through the very threads of reality. The Morgan remained motionless, her ancient eyes fixed on Sarah, waiting for her decision. "I need to get to the stone circle," Sarah said at last, standing up. "Now, before it's too late, we'll guide you," replied Morgan. "But remember, once the ritual begins, it cannot be interrupted. The consequences would be devastating." Sarah leaned over and kissed her grandfather's forehead, feeling that it might be the last time she would see him alive. "I love you, Grandpa. Rest in peace." "Go," whispered Patrick. "Do what needs to be done. I'll be here when you get back, one way or another." With the silver comb in one hand and the diary in the other, Sarah walked to the door. The banshees formed a silent procession behind her, their ethereal forms lighting the way. The Morgan floated ahead, guiding her to her destination. As she descended the stairs of the manor, Sarah could feel the weight of generations of O'Connor guardians on her shoulders. The moment of her true initiation had arrived, and with it, the revelation of the true sacrifice her mother had made so many years ago. The night awaited her, laden with secrets and ancient magic, and Sarah knew that when the sun rose again, nothing would ever be the same. The icy wind whipped Sarah's face as she made her way towards the stone circle, guided by Morgan and accompanied by the silent procession of banshees. The full moon illuminated the path through the ancient woods, its shadows dancing among the trees like restless spirits. As they approached the sacred site, Sarah could feel the ancient energy pulsing through the ground. The silver comb in her hands vibrated more and more strongly, responding to the proximity of the portal. The pages of her grandmother's diary rustled without wind, as if the words written there wanted to break free from the paper. "The circle was erected by the first O'Connors who came to these lands," he explained to Morgan, his voice echoing in Sarah's mind. "They recognized the power of the place and swore to protect it, establishing a lineage of guardians that endures to this day." The circle of stones finally revealed itself before them, 12 ancient monoliths arranged in a perfect pattern, each marked with Celtic symbols that seemed to glow under the moonlight. In the center, a 13th stone, smaller than the others, emerged from the ground like a finger pointing to the sky. "This is where your mother made her choice," said Morgan, hovering over the central stone. The portal was unstable, threatening to tear the veil between the worlds. She offered her own life force to seal it again. Sarah felt hot tears streaming down her face as she finally understood the true meaning of her mother's sacrifice. The memories of that fateful night began to clear in her mind. The supernatural scream she had heard was not a harbinger of death, but the sound of the portal being sealed with blood and magic. "The seal is weakening again," continued Morgan. "Can you feel it?" Sarah could. There was a vibration in the air, a subtle dissonance that made her teeth ache. Through her new perception, she could see ethereal fissures in the very fabric of reality, slowly growing like cracks in glass. The banshees took up positions around the circle, their wailing turning into an ancient chant that made the stones themselves resonate in harmony. Sarah opened her grandmother's diary to the ritual page, the ancient words glowing like fire on the page. "Before you begin," she warned Morgan, "you must fully understand what is at stake. The portal needs a living guardian, anchored in both the material and spiritual worlds. If you accept this role, you will never be able to leave these lands again. You will be bound to this place until another guardian takes your place." Sarah thought about her life in Dublin, the plans she had made, the dreams she had nurtured. It all seemed so distant now, so insignificant in the face of the responsibility that lay before her. The silver comb pulsed in her hands, and through it, Sarah felt the presence of all the guardians who had come before her. Her mother, her grandmother, and all the other O'Connor women who had dedicated their lives to protecting the balance between the worlds. "I accept," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the fear she felt. With her hands trembling slightly, she began to read the words of the ritual, her voice blending with the singing of the banshees. The ancient Gaelic flowed from her lips as if she had spoken it all her life, each syllable charged with power and purpose. As the ritual progressed, Sarah could feel a change taking place inside her. It was as if every cell in her body was being rewritten, attuned to the ancient forces that permeated the stone circle. The silver comb in her hands began to glow with a light so intense that it seemed to be made of liquid stars. Morgan floated over to her, his eyes burning like coals. The crucial moment is approaching. The portal must be sealed with blood and will. Sarah knew what she had to do. With the silver comb, she made a small cut in her palm, letting her blood drip onto the central stone. The drops seemed alive, snaking through the ancient symbols carved into the rock. A supernatural wind rose up, making Sarah's hair dance around her face. The cracks in reality began to close, sewn shut by the power of her voluntary sacrifice. Through her new perception, she could see the golden threads of energy intertwining, restoring the integrity of the veil between the worlds. It was then that she felt it, a familiar and beloved presence, so close that she could touch it. Her mother was there, not as a banshee, but as a soft, welcoming light that enveloped her. "You have chosen well, M.O. Store," whispered her mother's voice in her heart. The circle is complete once again. The ritual came to an end with one last verse spoken in unison by Sarah and the banshees. The light from the silver comb gradually dimmed, but Sarah could sense that something fundamental had changed. She was now connected not just to the circle of stones, but to the whole earth around her, every tree, every stone, every drop of dew. Morgan inclined her head in acknowledgement. "It is done. You are now the gatekeeper, Sarah O'Connor. May your vigil be long and your heart remain strong." The first lights of dawn were beginning to tint the horizon when Sarah felt it. The exact moment her grandfather left this world. The banshees raised their voices in a final lament, not of sadness, but a celebration for a life well lived and a duty fulfilled to the end. Sarah stood in the stone circle, feeling the weight and honor of her new role settle on her shoulders like a cloak. The silver comb, now an inseparable part of her being, gleamed softly in her hands, promising to guide her through the years and challenges to come. She was now the guardian, the protector, the bridge between worlds. And as the sun rose over the ancient O'Connor lands, Sarah knew she had found her true place, not just as the heir to an ancestral legacy, but as the continuer of a tradition that transcended time and death itself. The wind blew gently across the stone circle, carrying with it the echoes of ancient psalms and renewed promises, as a new guardian took up her post in the eternal vigil between the worlds. On an autumn morning, when the golden leaves danced gently in the wind, Cinderella woke up before the first ray of sunlight had even touched the windows of the Tremaine mansion. Her blue eyes, although tired, still held that special sparkle that not even years of hard work could erase. His blonde hair, tied back in a simple ponytail, framed a face that, despite its youth, already knew the weight of responsibility all too well. The mansion, once a place of joy and love when her parents were still alive, was now like a gilded prison. The long, ornate corridors, which had once echoed with laughter and music, now only conveyed the sound of her stepmother Lady Tremaine's impatient heels and her stepsisters Anastasia and Drizella's off-key screams. Cinderella clearly remembered the day her father brought Lady Tremaine and her daughters to live with them. At the time, only 8 years old, she believed she would finally have the family she had dreamed of since her mother's death. Her father, a prosperous merchant, was overjoyed at the idea of giving his beloved daughter a new mother. But fate had other plans, and less than a year later, he left on a business trip from which he never returned. It was then that Lady Tremaine's true nature revealed itself. In a matter of days, Cinderella was removed from her luxurious bedroom on the second floor and relegated to the cold, dusty attic. Her beautiful dresses were replaced by rags, and her jewels, inherited from her mother, mysteriously disappeared. From a beloved daughter, she became a servant in her own home. Now, 10 years later, at the age of 18, Cinderella had developed a meticulous routine to survive the endless days of work. She began her journey by feeding the chickens in the backyard, where at least she could talk to her only real friends, the little mice Jack and Gus, as well as various birds who always appeared to keep her company. "Good morning, my little friends," she whispered as she scattered corn around the chicken coop. Jack, the smartest and skinniest mouse, always replied with a cheerful "Good morning, Cinderella," in his squeaky voice, while Gus, the chubbiest and greediest mouse, was already busy trying to steal some grain for himself. The sun had barely risen when the cries began. "Cinderella, my breakfast?" It was Anastasia, her voice shrill. "Cinderella, where are my clean clothes?" This time it was Drizella, no less annoying. And finally, Lady Tremain's cold, calculated command, "Cinderella, come at once." With agile and silent steps, learned after years of practice, she went up and down the stairs of the mansion, balancing trays, carrying clean clothes, and answering the impossible commands of her half-sisters. Anastasia, with her red hair and pointed face, demanded that her coffee was just the right temperature. Drizella, brunette and always grumpy, complained about the way her ribbons had been ironed. Lady Tremaine watched everything with her feline eyes, sitting in her favorite armchair, stroking her fat, evil cat Lucifer. The animal, black as night, seemed to share his owner's cruelty, always chasing Cinderella's little friends and creating situations in which she would be reprimanded. Even in the midst of such contempt, Cinderella kept the memory of happy days alive in her heart. Sometimes, when she had finished her chores late at night, she would go up to the attic and sit by the round window, watching the royal castle shining in the distance. In his chest, a small flame of hope never went out, fueled by the stories his father used to tell him about love, courage, and magic. It was during one of these nights of contemplation that a royal herald passed through the streets of the kingdom, announcing news that would change everyone's destiny forever. The king had decided to hold a grand ball, where his son, Prince Christopher, would choose his future wife. All the young women in the kingdom were invited, regardless of their social standing. The news spread like wildfire through the Tremaine mansion. Anastasia and Drizella went into a frenzy of preparations, while Lady Tremaine saw this as the perfect opportunity to ensure that one of her daughters would become the future queen. Cinderella, hiding behind a curtain as she dusted the furniture, felt her heart race at the prospect of attending a festival for the first time in years. Gathering up all her courage, she approached Lady Tremaine that very evening. "Stepmother, the invitation goes out to all the young ladies of the kingdom. I too am a young lady of the realm." Lady Tremaine, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, replied with false sweetness, "Yes, dear, you're right. If you can finish all your chores and find something suitable to wear, I don't see why you can't go." Cinderella could hardly believe her ears. She ran up to the attic, where she kept her most precious treasure, a dress that had belonged to her mother. It was a little old-fashioned and would need a few adjustments, but with the help of her little friends, who were already offering to search the house for ribbons and buttons, she knew she could turn it into something special. What Cinderella didn't know was that that night would only mark the beginning of an extraordinary journey, where magic, love, and courage would intertwine to change not only her destiny, but that of the entire kingdom. On the horizon, a fairy godmother was already watching intently, waiting for the right moment to enter the scene and help that special young girl find her true path to happiness. In the days following the announcement of the royal ball, the Tremaine mansion turned into chaos. Anastasia and Drizella ran around, demanding that Cinderella alter dresses, adjust bows, and create ever more elaborate hairstyles. Their attempts to look elegant often resulted in comic disasters that only Cinderella could discreetly solve. During the evenings, after finishing her daily chores, Cinderella worked tirelessly on her own dress. Jack and Gus, along with other mice, had managed to find lost pearls under the furniture, forgotten ribbons in drawers, and even a beautiful pink fabric that Drizella had discarded after one of her usual fits of rage. "Cinderella, look what we've found!" exclaimed Jack one evening, dragging along a blue satin bow that would perfectly complement the dress. Cinderella couldn't hold back her tears of gratitude when she saw the efforts of her little friends. Lady Tremaine, noticing Cinderella's discreet enthusiasm, deliberately increased her daily chores. "Oh dear," she said with false concern, "the curtains in the music room need to be washed again. And don't forget to polish all the silverware. The floor of the main hall is also in need of a good scrubbing." Even so, Cinderella was not discouraged. As she mopped the floor, she hummed softly, imagining herself dancing in the castle ballroom. Her movements with the mop turned into waltz steps, and for a few magical moments, she allowed herself to dream of a different life. One day, while cleaning the attic, Cinderella found an old book of fairy tales that had belonged to her mother. The yellowed pages contained stories about princesses, fairy godmothers, and happy endings. One illustration in particular caught her eye: a young girl in a beautiful ball gown, dancing with a prince. Something in that image lit an even bigger flame of hope in her heart. "You know, Jack," she confided to the little mouse while sewing by candlelight, "sometimes I think my mother is watching me from somewhere, hoping I don't lose faith. She always said that kindness is the greatest magic there is." The days passed quickly and the ball was approaching. The whole town was abuzz with preparations. Merchants displayed their finest silks and jewels. Shoemakers worked day and night to fulfill orders, and young dreamers bowed in front of mirrors, imagining the moment when they would meet the prince. At the castle, Prince Christopher himself was less than enthusiastic about the idea of the ball. "Father," he argued with the king, "don't you think there's a less theatrical way of finding a wife?" The king, a short, pudgy man with a passion for sweets and traditions, just laughed at his son's concerns. "Nonsense. A royal ball is exactly what this kingdom needs. Besides," he added with a mischievous grin, "I'm too old to wait any longer for my grandchildren." At the Tremaine mansion, the eve of the big day arrived with unprecedented excitement. Anastasia had decided that her green dress needed more frills, while Drizella insisted that her jewelry wasn't extravagant enough. Lady Tremaine watched everything with a satisfied smile, already planning how one of her daughters could capture the prince's attention. Cinderella, for her part, had finally finished her dress. It wasn't as luxurious as her stepsister's, but there was something special about it. Every stitch had been made with love, every detail chosen with care. The result was a simple but elegant dress that highlighted her natural beauty. "It's perfect, Cinderella," exclaimed Gus, spinning around happily while the other mice applauded. Even the birds that used to visit her window seemed to approve, trilling a cheerful tune. That night, while helping her stepsisters with the final preparations for the ball, Cinderella allowed herself to dream about what would happen the next day. She imagined herself walking down the steps of the mansion in her refurbished dress, getting into the carriage with her family, and finally, after so many years, having a night of merriment and dancing. What she didn't know was that fate sometimes has more extraordinary plans than our wildest dreams can imagine, and that, somewhere not too far away, a fairy godmother was already preparing her magic wand, knowing that the moment to transform the life of that special young girl was closer than ever. As night fell over the city, the stars seemed to shine a little brighter, as if they too were looking forward to what was to come. In the Tremaine mansion, Cinderella fell asleep with a smile on her lips, her heart full of hope for the day that was about to dawn. The big day finally arrived, bringing with it unprecedented excitement to the Tremaine mansion. The sun had barely risen when Cinderella was already on her feet, rushing around to help her stepsisters with the final preparations. Anastasia demanded that her curls be perfectly styled, while Drizella kept complaining that her dress needed more adjustments. "Cinderella, where's my pearl necklace?" cried Anastasia from the top of the stairs. "Cinderella, my shoes are tight," cried Drizella from her bedroom. The young girl rushed to answer all the calls, keeping a serene smile on her face, because she knew that in a few hours it would be her turn to get ready for the ball. In between tasks, Cinderella discreetly went up to the attic to admire her refurbished dress, now hanging behind a screen. Jack and Gus stood guard proudly beside the dress, like little sentries protecting a precious treasure. "You're going to be the prettiest at the ball." "Cinderella," said Jack with conviction, while Gus nodded enthusiastically, his cheeks streaked with crumbs from the breakfast Cinderella had shared with them. As the afternoon progressed, the anxiety in the mansion reached its peak. Lady Tremaine oversaw every detail of her daughter's preparations with an eagle eye, ensuring that nothing was out of place. Her plans to arrange a royal wedding for one of her daughters could not be ruined by any slip-up. Finally, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Cinderella finished her chores and ran up to the attic to get ready. With the help of her little friends, she took a quick bath and began to dress. Her blonde hair was tied up in an elegant bun, with a few loose strands framing her face. The dress, although simple compared to those of her half-sisters, fit her slender body perfectly. The blue ribbons and satin bow that the mice had found added a special touch to the outfit. Cinderella turned in front of the small broken mirror, feeling truly beautiful for the first time in many years. "I'm ready," she announced, gracefully descending the stairs. Lady Tremaine and her daughters, already fully dressed, were waiting in the drawing room. The moment her eyes landed on Cinderella was one of pure shock. But, that's my lace," squealed Drizella, pointing to the blue satin on Cinderella's dress. "And those are my old pearls," exclaimed Anastasia, recognizing the tiny details on the bodice. Lady Tremaine watched the scene with a dangerous glint in her eyes. "So," she said in a soft voice that barely disguised her fury, "you stole my daughter's belongings to make your dress?" "No, stepmother," protested Cinderella. "I found these discarded things. They were just leftovers that..." But before she could finish her explanation, Anastasia and Drizella advanced on her like beasts. "Thief!" they shouted, pulling at the ribbons, tearing at the fabric, destroying the work of weeks and seconds. Cinderella watched in horror as her dream fell to pieces before her eyes. Lady Tremaine did nothing to stop her daughters. When they were finally satisfied with the destruction, she just said coldly, "Well, it looks like you don't have anything suitable to wear to the ball anymore. Too bad. Come on, girls, the carriage is waiting for us." With a cruel smile, she led Anastasia and Drizella out of the mansion, leaving Cinderella alone amidst the wreckage of her dress and her dreams. The tears she had held back for so long finally began to fall. Running to the back garden, Cinderella threw herself onto a stone bench, sobbing uncontrollably. Her little friends followed her, trying to offer consolation, but for the first time, their presence wasn't enough to ease her pain. "I was foolish to think I could go to the ball," she whispered through her tears. "I was foolish to believe that something magical could happen to me." It was at that moment that something extraordinary began to happen. Tiny lights, like golden fireflies, began to dance around the garden. The air seemed to become lighter, more sparkling, and a sweet, motherly voice sounded close to Cinderella. "Don't cry, dear. All magic begins with a tear of hope." Cinderella raised her watery eyes and was stunned by what she saw. Before her stood a kindly-looking lady, dressed in a shimmering blue cloak and holding a wand that glowed softly in the night. Her smile was so warm and comforting that Cinderella felt her heart calm instantly. "Oh, who are you?" she asked, still not believing her eyes. "Why, my dear," replied the lady with an even wider smile, "I'm your fairy godmother, of course, and the time has come to turn your tears into something truly magical." The fairy godmother raised her glittering wand and, with one smooth movement, began to chant the magic words, "Bibbidi-bobbidi-boo." The whole garden filled with golden light, and tiny magical sparks danced in the night air. Cinderella watched in amazement as her fairy godmother began to work her magic. "First," said the fairy with a playful smile, "we need a carriage fit for a princess." Her eyes roamed the garden until they found a large pumpkin. With another wave of her wand, the pumpkin began to grow and transform. Its sides expanded, gaining elegant curves and golden details, until it became a magnificent carriage that sparkled like crystal in the moonlight. "Now we need horses," continued the fairy, with a few more graceful flicks of her wand, for Cinderella's mouse friends, including Jack and Gus, were transformed into majestic white horses. Their hair shimmered like silk, and their manes fluttered in the wind like satin ribbons. "But who will drive?" asked Cinderella, still absorbed in the magical spectacle unfolding before her eyes. The fairy godmother laughed softly and, with another wave, transformed an old garden lizard into an elegant coachman, dressed in an impeccable uniform. "And we mustn't forget the minions," she exclaimed, transforming 2 friendly mice into garrulous minions, who immediately took up their positions beside the carriage. Finally, the fairy godmother turned her attention to Cinderella. "And now, my dear, we're going to take care of you." With a flick of her wand, magical sparks enveloped Cinderella in a swirl of light. Her torn rags began to transform, the simple fabric giving way to a delicate silk that seemed woven with moonlight. The dress that emerged was a sky blue so pure that it seemed to capture the sky itself. The swirling skirt floated as if it were made of clouds, and tiny crystals sparkled across the length of the fabric like stars. Her hair was magically arranged in an elegant hairstyle, adorned with tiny crystal flowers that sparkled with every movement. But the final touch, and perhaps the most magical of all, were the little shoes. Made entirely of crystal, they reflected the light like diamonds and fitted Cinderella's feet perfectly, as if they had been sculpted especially for her. "They're perfect," exclaimed Cinderella, turning to admire her reflection in a nearby pool of water. She could hardly recognize the elegant and graceful young woman she saw reflected. "Remember, my dear," warned the fairy godmother in a more serious tone, "all magic has its price. The enchantment will only last until the last stroke of midnight. When the clock strikes 12, everything will go back to the way it was before." Cinderella nodded, firmly engraving the warning in her mind. "I understand, fairy godmother. I'll be back before midnight, I promise." With the help of her minions, she climbed into the carriage, her heart beating fast with anticipation. Through the window, she saw her fairy godmother waving with a motherly smile. "Go, my dear, and remember, be true to yourself, for it is your goodness that makes you truly special." The carriage drove off gently into the night, and Cinderella felt as if she were living in a dream. The city streets looked different from inside that magical carriage, and every time they passed, people stopped to admire the extraordinary spectacle. At the castle, the ball was already in full swing. The main hall glowed with thousands of candles, and the orchestra played soft waltzes while dozens of couples danced gracefully across the marble hall. Prince Christopher, meanwhile, looked bored as he was introduced to an endless succession of young noble women. Lady Tremaine watched from a corner of the ballroom, proud to see Anastasia and Drizella trying to catch the prince's eye with their exaggerated movements and boisterous laughter. Other guests whispered and laughed discreetly at the sisters' clumsy attempts. It was at that moment that a murmur of admiration went through the hall. All eyes turned to the entrance, where an ethereal figure had just appeared. Cinderella, in her magical dress, was slowly descending the grand staircase, her little crystal shoes tinkling softly against the marble steps. Prince Christopher himself, who until then had shown complete disinterest in the ball, was immediately mesmerized by the sight. Without hesitation, he crossed the hall towards the mysterious newcomer, ignoring his father's whispered protests and Lady Tremaine's furious glances. "Excuse me," he said, bowing before Cinderella. "Would you do me the honor of this dance?" Cinderella, her heart pounding, bowed gracefully and accepted the prince's outstretched hand. The orchestra began a new waltz, and soon the two were dancing, lost in their own magical world. Their movements were so perfect and natural that it seemed as if they had been born to dance together. "I've never seen you before," commented the prince as they twirled around the ballroom. "I'm sure I'd remember." Cinderella smiled mysteriously, feeling more confident than she had ever been. "Perhaps some people aren't exactly as they seem at first glance, Your Highness." The prince laughed, charmed by her enigmatic response. "Please call me Christopher. And you are—" But before Cinderella could answer, the first chime of midnight echoed through the hall. Her heart froze as she realized that she was so engrossed in the dance that she had completely lost track of time. "Oh no," whispered Cinderella, her heart racing with every chime of the clock. "Forgive me, but I must go," she said to the prince, letting go of his arms and running toward the staircase. "Wait," called Christopher, trying to catch up with her. "I don't even know your name." Cinderella ran as fast as she could, her little crystal shoes echoing against the marble. In her haste, she didn't notice when one of them slipped off her foot on the way down the stairs. The prince, seeing the slippers shining in the candlelight, stopped to pick it up, losing precious seconds in the chase. The young woman reached her magical carriage just in time for the 6th chime. The horses, sensing the urgency of the moment, galloped swiftly through the city streets. With each new chime, Cinderella could feel the magic beginning to unravel. At the 9th stroke, the coachman and his minions began to tremble, their elegant forms oscillating between human and animal. On the 10th, the carriage began to lose its crystalline shine, orange spots appearing on its sides. With the 11th chime, Cinderella jumped out of the carriage, which was already beginning to shrink, and ran through the mansion garden. At the exact moment the 12th chime sounded, she was safe in her attic, wearing her rags again, but still with a crystal slipper on her foot, the only tangible proof that that magical night had not been just a dream. In the castle, Prince Christopher held the other slipper, determined to find his mysterious dancer. "Father," he declared to the king, who was watching the scene with a mixture of concern and amusement, "I will find the owner of this shoe even if I have to visit every house in the kingdom." The next morning, a royal decree was announced. The Grand Duke would visit every home in the kingdom, taking the little crystal shoe with him. The young woman whose foot fit the shoe perfectly would be recognized as the mysterious lady of the ball, and, if she so wished, could marry the prince. When Lady Tremaine heard the news, she locked Cinderella in the attic. "We can't risk this chance going to waste," she muttered to herself, keeping the key in her pocket. While Anastasia and Drizella frantically prepared for the Grand Duke's arrival, Jack and Gus, who had witnessed everything, worked tirelessly to steal the key from Lady Tremaine's pocket. It was a dangerous mission, especially with Lucifer always nearby, but they knew it was Cinderella's only chance. The Grand Duke arrived at the Tremaine mansion at precisely 3 in the afternoon. Anastasia was the first to try to put the shoe on, wriggling her toes and straining her foot in every possible way. Drizella was no more successful, going so far as to almost break the precious crystal in her desperate attempt. In the attic, Cinderella could hear all the commotion. Her heart was racing as Jack and Gus finally managed to hand her the key after an exciting adventure that involved distracting Lucifer with an ingenious trap. "Are there any other young ladies in this house?" asked the Grand Duke, preparing to leave. "Me," called out Cinderella, descending the stairs with grace, even in her simple attire. "I'd like to try on a shoe if I may." Lady Tremaine tried to interfere, but she's only a maid. But the royal decree was clear. Every young girl should have her chance. Cinderella sat down in the chair, and before the Grand Duke could even approach the shoe, she pulled out her identical pair from her pocket. The whole filled with exclamations of surprise when she put on both shoes, which fitted perfectly. At that moment, her fairy godmother appeared in a swirl of magical light. With a wave of her wand, she transformed Cinderella's simple clothes into the same dazzling dress from the night of the ball. "That's her," exclaimed the Grand Duke. "The mysterious lady of the ball." Prince Christopher, who had insisted on personally accompanying some of the visitors, rushed into the mansion when he heard the commotion. His eyes met Cinderella's, and all the love they had shared during that magical dance returned in full force. "I knew I'd find you," he said, taking her hands in his. "But now I need to know, what is your name?" "Cinderella," she replied softly, "and my whole life has been a preparation for this moment." The wedding was celebrated a few weeks later, with all the pomp and circumstance that a royal event deserved. Cinderella, radiant in her wedding dress, made sure that her little friends took places of honor at the ceremony. Jack and Gus, wearing tiny formal clothes, couldn't have been prouder. Lady Tremaine and her daughters were invited to move to a remote estate where they lived to reflect on their past actions. The Tremaine mansion was transformed into an orphanage where destitute children found not only shelter but also love and hope. As a final magical surprise, the fairy godmother presented the couple with a pair of crystal slippers for their first daughter, ensuring that the magic and love would live on for generations. And so Cinderella discovered that her mother was right. Kindness really is the greatest magic there is. Her gentle heart and resilient spirit had been her true strength during all those difficult years. And now they were the basis of her happiness alongside the prince who had won her heart. Did they live happily ever after? Well, real life has its ups and downs, but Cinderella and Christopher faced every challenge together with love, understanding, and that hint of magic that exists in every heart that remains open to dreaming. And on clear nights with a full moon, it is said that a magical carriage can still be seen crossing the kingdom's skies, reminding everyone that fairy tales can indeed come true. You just have to believe and keep kindness in your heart.